I think it's incorrect to look at the Shams al-Ma'arif as just quote unquote a book of magic or a grimoire or a book filled with spells. I do think there's a very deep cosmological component there. There's an orderly universe, and that, I believe, is the primary reason that the magic is going to be effective.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about the Sun of Knowledge with Dr. Amina Inloes and J. Hamade. One of the most beautiful things about this grimoire resurgence or renaissance that we're living in is the amount of incredible scholars and translators and practitioners who are connecting the dots between different traditions from all over the world. For example, many of the spirits that we find in the European grimoires actually can be traced back to Islamic esotericism, such as in the Latin Heptameron grimoire. The King of the Air for Sunday, Varkan Rex, can actually be traced back to Barqan Malik, the Jinn King of Wednesday. In fact, the Islamic esoteric tradition is so vast and so rich that full translations of grimoires and magical tracts from Arabic into English have been sparse in many ways, especially in regards to the Sun of Knowledge. In Arabic, this is called the Shams al-Ma'arif, which is one of the most revered historical grimoires of the Arabic corpus. It's feared by some, it's hallowed by others, and it's one of the most famous or infamous books in the Arabic-speaking and Islamicate world. Written in Egypt in the 13th century by a Sufi mystic and mage of Algerian origin, the Shams al-Ma'arif presents the fundamentals of Arabic Islamic occult work, from spiritual cosmology and astrology, including various particularly lunar magics, to working with spirits and jinn, magical employment of letters and numbers, and the occult applications of the Quran. With all of this together, that means the Shams al-Ma'arif comprises a veritable encyclopedia of Islamicate magical wisdom and formulae. And for the first time in English through Revelore Press, our next guests have translated the first 8 chapters of the Shams al-Ma'arif, of the Sun of Knowledge grimoire, as well as excerpts from other chapters from the original Arabic. Dr. Amina Inloes is an Islamic theologian and academic with a PhD in Islamic studies from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, with a special interest in esoteric theology and the uncanny. And J. Hamade is a talismanic artist, a florist, a diviner, a writer, and educator, currently residing in New York City. Jay specializes in various traditions of image magic with a focus on astrology, star lore, and talismanic craftsmanship. And his work bridges contemporary aesthetics with time-tested magical techniques rooted in astrological magic. I think you'll really enjoy this discussion about the importance of context and history and magical delving with Dr. Inloes and J. In other words, these are among the 2 best people to ask about the Shams al-Ma'arif. Also, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your wonderful questions for Dr. Inloes and J. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Dr. Amina Inloes and J. Hamade. Dr. Amina Inloes and J. Hamade, thank you both so much for coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a lot of fun to be able to discuss this.
Thanks for having us. You were the first person to pronounce my last name correctly. Maybe the first person of all time.
Well, I must give credit to Dr. Inloes because I checked and I said, I am a stickler for proper pronunciation. I was in radio for many years, and so Dr. Inloes did assist me as well. So
you have an Arabic background as well, correct?
Yes, yes, I did. That was my minor when I studied at university as well. So
remarkable.
The honor is certainly mine, Dr. Inloes and Jay. And before we get to your incredibly what I would call epic and very much needed translation and commentary on the chapters of the Shams al-Ma'arif. Before we get there, can you both just kind of each take some time and just share a little bit about your background with our listeners? How did you first become acquainted with or immersed in Islamic esotericism and practices?
You go first.
Okay. So I was raised Shia on my father's side. And I guess for much of my life, my religious background wasn't much of a thing for me. As a teenager, I was much more interested in punk and heavy metal and religion and mysticism and all these kinds of things that occupy so much of my time now weren't really on the radar for me, although perhaps they were in more subtle ways and looking back at it. I think for this particular content, I took a university course about a decade ago just called Islamic Mysticism with the professor Muhammad Azadpour at San Francisco State University. And it blew my mind how rich, as you mentioned, this tradition is, how vast this tradition is. And then for me, sort of began this journey of attempting to recover something which is in my ancestry, and yet so much of it I was never told about. And so much of what I received felt so bland to me, especially as a teenager, which, I mean, you know, teenagers be teenagers, of course, anyways. But now getting into the esoteric stuff at university and dialoguing about it and seeing how juicy it really is, it's like, oh, this is actually extremely exciting. Like, oh, this is in my religion. This is in my ancestry. This is here. This is fascinating. And so I think about a decade ago, after taking that course, give strong credit to Professor Azadpour for then setting off, 10 years worth now to this point of increasing interest in this area. I think the other thing that I have to give credit to is astrology. And though I don't refer to myself as an astrologer outright, I think my divination practice is 80% based around astrology. And getting into I'd say the Hellenistic material first, and then seeing what the Islamicate authors would go on to do later, and then their own elaborations of much of this stuff. Of course, leading to the lunar mansions, which is how Amina and I met. But I think astrology was really the other big angle for me in getting deeper into this material.
Juicy. I love that adjective. We can add that to rich and to this vast tradition. And Dr. Inloes, how did you first become immersed in the esoteric tradition?
Well, the fate of my life ended up being that I would work in religion, specifically Islam, as my day job, at sort of straddling, I guess, between more, academic or what's conventional in the West, that sort of study. But the place I work at is best described as a seminary, as well as a lot of work in the Muslim community. So from that angle, when you are working with religion as a day job, you are essentially working with the non-visible and attempting to organize the non-visible, and sometimes attempting to manipulate the non-visible, however one chooses to go about doing it. And certainly there is, I'm sure you'd agree, there is a blurry line between what is mysticism and what is magic. So I would say this sort of thing was always there. And I'm, being more of an abstract thinker, I probably like to think about the stuff that's there. I do much better with that than organizing my day-to-day schedule and so forth. But that being said, with respect to being a bit more focused on this sort of tradition that we're talking about today, I think there's a couple things. One is that it is clear there's been an advance in interest in this subject over the past few years. I mean, I really don't recall it being talked about outside of mystical circles or maybe Sufi circles like 15 years ago or so. I mean, it was something you'd hear about, but it wasn't something that you could go online. I mean, they didn't even have online, 20 years ago, but they did actually. 25 years ago, they didn't have online. But you wouldn't just find loads of information about it. And there has been a sort of explosion, and some of that has been the academic research and translation and authoring movement, like with the respected Liana Saif and so forth, and the other guests who you mentioned. And also in the community of people who do like to practice occult things, there's a lot more interest. So I think that also pulled me in because there was a space for this. Whereas if there was a space before, it just wasn't on my radar. And that might have been my life and just the circles I was in and the situations I was in. So that was part of it for me. And also I had a series of spiritual experiences over starting about age 19 or so that pushed me in this direction as well. So of course there has to be a little bit of weird involved.
How did you two meet, first of all? And that's number one. And number two, how did you two decide to tackle one of the most, I think it's fair to say, in the Islamic esoteric tradition, probably one of the most massive grimoires or compendiums out there, Ahmed al-Buni's Shams al-Ma'arif. So how did you meet and how did that happen?
Roughly 2 years ago, it was actually almost exactly 2 years ago now. I taught a course at the Salem Summer Symposium put on by the Cauldron Black. And it was right when the pandemic was really getting going. So they were doing it on Zoom. And at the time I was working with Spanish translation of about half of the Shams al-Ma'arif because my other side of my family is from Mexico and I'm always working back between Spanish and Arabic. It's its own thing. But I was working with a Spanish translation and going back and forth between the Spanish, the English, and the Arabic, and picking apart the section on the lunar mansions and decided to teach a class on it. And Amina took the class, and we got to chatting after the class, and she was adamant, almost immediately. I suppose already adamant, or this was something she was already thinking about, that she wanted to do a translation of the Shams. And she was like, this is something we should do. And I, as I've been saying, have been sort of riding her coattails and her fiery initiative, with this project since then and continue to. But yeah, it was really her just bringing it up as something that she wanted to do. And I don't know, perhaps you want to speak to that?
So we met under the moon and in the lunar mansions.
That's much more romantic.
I forget exactly which lunar mansion it was, but I suppose we could figure it out if we really tried. So on my side, I thought about it before because there was some interest. And at that time, I would say interest was really starting to build. I had played with it before, but it's a big book and I wasn't quite sure how many people would actually want it. And I don't tend to measure things that I do based on the audience. I might write something and expect 3 people will read it. But if they're really benefiting from it, I feel like it's worthwhile. I feel like the important thing is just to put it out there. But all the same, it does help to have people who are ready to accept it, if you will. And also, someone I know who has a very strong grounding in this subject area, who's in a rather elderly age bracket, did encourage me to do it, maybe a year or so before. And so I took it seriously what they said because this person has a lot of wisdom. But it's just when you have other things to do in life, you have a day job and other commitments, things don't always get done. So I do think the fact that I had the opportunity to meet Jay did really push it forward. And it was definitely, I feel like having 2 people involved was very helpful. It's just helpful to be able to discuss things back and forth, to have motivation, to develop a vision together. So I don't really think I would have done it on my own. But from where I'm standing, there was a sort of Gandalf figure standing there giving me the quest. It just took a while for me to pick up the quest. But I'm glad that we got this far.
For the listeners out there who might be wondering, what makes the Son of Knowledge, the Shams al-Ma'arif, what makes it such a daunting task, such a to continue the Lord of the Rings analogy, kind of a Mount Doom just looming there, hundreds of pages, there's various Arabic manuscript. What makes it so challenging, if that's the right word, in terms of people actually saying, I'm going to give a full translation from cover to cover?
Yeah, right. Right. People do full translations into other languages, so I shouldn't be cynical. Yeah, there are a lot of things that are daunting. I think that's an appropriate word. One thing to keep in mind is, like many other jobs, translation is a step-by-step process, and there's no shortcuts to do it properly. You have to go word for word and frequently several times over each word for word. And it's a big book. One of the things that adds to the challenge is you really can't use the printed edition. Frankly, I'm not quite sure what you can do with the printed edition except use it as a doorstop. Sorry, that's disrespectful. I don't use it as a doorstop. But for anyone who's actually read it, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look through it, it's missing parts of sentences that they've just substituted words that would kind of look like the word in the original. And I don't think it's intentional obfuscation. It's just very buggy, is how I've been discussing it. So you can't rely on that as a source material. Whereas obviously, for most people like myself, not everyone, I know you've had some guests on who love their manuscripts, but I would rather just look at a printed book than, I mean, I like to look at manuscripts, but if I'm going to be looking at it every day, all day, it's helpful to have the printed version and easier to get a hold of it too. So that's one issue. And then once you get into the manuscripts, they don't all agree with each other. There are some parts where there is a good amount of agreement, but at some point they tend to diverge or drop things. And this was also a decision that had to be made in this. You know, as you can see in the notes, it's not a formal critical edition just because that wasn't really what I was trying to do. But there were some cases where decisions had to be made about which one to use or what to put in it, or do you put alternate things, or do you put this paragraph that's in this one but not that one. Collating is a challenge, and of course people do it. To bring her up again, Liana Saif is doing it with the Ghayat al-Hakim, and she's doing an excellent job. But for work this size, it does add to that. So that's part of it as well. I do think perhaps it also just wasn't quite the right time. I do believe that things happen when they're meant to happen. And I think it wasn't quite the time, say 10 years ago in the English-speaking world, but it is today, or it was a year ago when it came out. And so I'm glad to have been here at this special time. But there is more to do. I look at this and it is just a drop. And then if someone has an interest in the Islamic hate corpus, whether it's the occult literature or we've mentioned the astrological literature, there's a lot out there. And so this really is a little droplet in all the stuff that's out there.
I think the size of the text is an obvious reason. The language was another one that, once again, before I had met Amina, I was sending it around to quite a few different native Arabic speakers, looking at it myself, and just the density of the medieval metaphysical language is challenging for, once again, even native Arabic speakers. So if you're a weird kid like me who's interested in all this strange stuff, and it's like, oh, I think I want to translate more of this text, you come up against these academic barriers, for lack of a better term, of like, you don't have the linguistic skills to be able to go through this with enough of a critical eye to take apart the language and translate it in a way that's coherent enough. And that also goes along with just the size of the text itself. In kind of speculating on these things a little bit more outside of the more obvious reasons, I get this sense that there have been people who have perhaps wanted to do the translation and then in the process of undertaking it have felt a kind of responsibility to the text, to the spirits of the text, many of them also protecting the book itself from not coming out in a particular iteration or at a certain time, like Amina mentioned, and those same spirits being like, now is not the right time, so maybe not you, not now. Like I said, this is purely my own speculation. But as the other side of that, people engaging with it who are very much capable of engaging with it and of translating it, perhaps feeling like there's a responsibility to the text and to the spirits who, maintain and reside with the text, not to, this is going to sound really harsh, but throw pearls before swine in some sense of like the Anglosphere, occult world, the English-speaking world, and the person attempting to translate it, getting a sense of like, I don't know if the English-speaking world, the people who are going to be reading this translation, if they are going to truly appreciate what this is at this time. And then feeling the sense of like, okay, I'm going to stop and not go any further with this. It's a sense that I've gotten, and spending time around it. But once again, just my speculation.
I would agree that there is stuff surrounding the book, like other important books in other mystical, esoteric, and occult traditions. And I do think that whatever gets done is done through the permission of this stuff. And, the concept of having permission from one's sheikh or one's forebears is important in Sufism and the mystical lineages. And so I think for whatever reason, they permitted this much to come out. And if we have the quote unquote whole thing, it will be because they've allowed it for whatever reason.
Can you give us some context around the text itself? Who was Ahmed al-Buni, and when was the Son of Knowledge, the Shams al-Ma'arif, first put to parchment, if you will?
Well, you covered pretty much what we know about him in your introduction. Yeah, that covers it. Sometimes when we try to dig too much for biographical details about people who lived significantly before us, it does transition from the wholly factual to the guesswork, when we're digging around for small details, and he is no different. He was clearly part of the Sufi tradition with a strong mystical bent, and definitely an interest in the applied uses of mystical practice, and he was known as a teacher of that. I tend to see him as a sort of pivot point, and this is just my sense of him. Obviously, I'm not there in the 13th century, but I feel like his ego doesn't really come to the party here, so to speak. There are some authors where you do feel it's directly about them, and you can kind of imagine them standing there in their finery, which he wouldn't have been doing as like Sufi and stuff. But the point is, you get a strong sense that this is the author's thing, and I feel a bit more like he's stepped back and just allowed it to come through. And obviously, he's not, for the most part at least, taking credit for making up new things. It's more about synthesizing the received tradition and some things in the mystical tradition as well, and then arranging it in a way that's suitable and usable, and then presenting it. Now, of course, that does involve some authorial work, and obviously it tacitly involves his opinions. But nonetheless, I basically that's how I see him, I guess, as a doorway or a gate, which I do think is the ideal of the Sufi mystical tradition, that the person is sort of a gateway for divine power or gives up the ego to God. And so it's not about them, it's about everything else. And within the mystical tradition, that would be seen as the source of the mystic's power. Insofar as Muslims, like in some other religions, oftentimes hold that if someone is, very spiritual or very close to God, they're imbued with a sort of mystical charisma, and they can just do stuff. And they don't even need to get out these numbers and these talismans, lay people like me would have to do, but they just have this magical power because of their great spirituality. That's how I see him. Now, of course, it's fairly apparent, at least I think it's apparent or mostly agreed upon, that not everything that is attributed to him today in the big book did actually come through his hand. I would guess there is a certain core set of material that did come from him in the 13th century. And then there's other stuff that's been appended. I would say this is something I didn't have a sensitivity to before actually doing the translation of this part, but I did start to pick up on what I thought were very subtle shifts in the authorial voice, or very subtle contradictions in other parts of the book. It doesn't really jump out at you. There may be people who are doing this sort of analysis, because overall the book, it is somehow tied together and the same phraseology does repeat. But in any case, it is generally held that some of it is his and some of it was not. But yes, as you mentioned, he was born in Algeria. The name would suggest he was from the place known as Buna. I'm given to understand that this was called Hippo Regius back in the olden days, and nowadays it is the city of Annaba. It's clear from the text that he was well educated. He is citing the Quran and the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad fluently, so we would assume he had a sort of traditional scholarly education. And of course, back in the day, people would tend to send their kids to Quran school young and memorize it. So this would have been a normal thing to do among the learned. And it is also just clear from the words he's using, like Jay was mentioning, he does use the formal Islamic philosophical and esoteric terminology, which is a sort of jargon in the field. And from that, as well as some stylistic things, it does seem he has a familiarity with the higher literature. It is said he shared a mystical teacher with the famous mystic Ibn Arabi. So this is part of that mystical efflorescence in that time. He is given the epithet, or the, part of his name is Al-Qarashi, which literally would mean he's a paternal descendant of the Prophet's tribe, the Quraysh. I would point out personally, I do take those things with a grain of salt. It's quite possible he is a paternal descendant of the Prophet's tribe, but sometimes there might have been some motivation for people to claim that just for a bit of status. God knows best. I'm not casting aspersions on him or saying he was doing it, but, could have been like 5 generations before or whatever. But in any case, that is mentioned, and there was the Arab Islamic world did expand into North Africa before his time. But beyond that, there isn't really a lot known about him. At some point, he moved to Egypt. He is said to have taught his students in the great necropolis in Egypt, and he was laid to rest there, and people would sometimes visit his shrine for blessings, which is also quite common with Sufi saints. And that's really, I think, about it, unless, Jay, you have a few things you want to add about his life.
I think it's fair to think of him also as a legendary magician, in the same vein as a Cyprian, in the same vein as a Solomon, this sort of thing, wherein, obviously the Shams in particular being related to him, but because so many other people have come to the text and it has all of these accretions, embodying as a bab, as a doorway in this way, as you said, Amina, for all of these other things to come to pass through and out of as well, including other writers, other magically inclined people, other Sufis. And the legendary magician trope has all of that surrounding it, right? There's a biographical person, there's a historical person, and then there's this legendary magic figure, which I do think he takes part in. I also think it's kind of neat to look at the time period that he was living and writing in. As Amina mentioned,
it was a crash and burn time period.
we've talked about this quite a bit on other shows and amongst ourselves, but this being the beginning of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions in air signs that we are now going through at our current time, and all of the huge changes. This is something that was very much emphasized by the Islamic astrological tradition, these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and the different ages. And so he was at the beginning, along with Ibn Arabi, of this movement into conjunctions and air signs. And I think also, once again, around the same time period, people get it with Ibn Arabi the most, and he's more well known in that respect. But really the beginnings of what gets called lettrism or hurufism, focusing on the magical qualities of letters in particular, but obviously letters being constituent parts of the names of God, of course, and all these other things, which I'm sure we're going to touch on. But this emphasis, and I think that's appropriate if you know your astrology about air signs, this emphasis on language, right? And this movement towards mystical language, really kind of reaching an apex and being initiated by these great thinkers at this time. I think it's appropriate. So there's the historical personage, there's this legendary magical personage, and then there's also this man living in a very particular time where big changes are happening.
Basically, he was living at the end for all intents and purposes. I don't want to use the phrase Islamic Golden Age casually. I know it is a contested phrase. But if we do look at the early flourishing of Islamic civilization, including the Arabic translation movement and the development of Islamicate philosophy and occult texts, he was pretty much near the end. If you take the fall of Baghdad and the Mongol invasion to be the end, he passed away a couple decades before it, maybe 3 decades before it. And that was something that really shook the collective mindset. Some people thought it was the end of the world, having these invading hordes. And that radically changed the civilization, the broader civilization he was a part of. Of course, one can see that there were signs of decline before that, but that is considered to be basically the dividing line. And then the beginning of, well, if you will, a new world order, which some people are predicting these days as well. I have thought to some degree, and we've talked about this as well, was he aware that this was the end of an era and the beginning of another? Was he aware of impending changes? I mean, certainly with respect to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, others before him in the Arabic Islamic culture had discussed it. He makes a reference to it in his book. I imagine that could have been on his mind. People who are mystically inclined tend to pick up on the direction things are going. And that sometimes also is oftentimes said to sort of to push forward more recourse to mysticism or the occult in society. So it is quite possible he was cognizant of his role at that time. And that being said, as I think Jay was alluding to, I think it's fair to speak of him as an archetypal person. I don't always like to project that on people in history, because once we get into seeing them as archetypes, we are losing who they were as human beings. But I think for people who are genuinely committed to a mystical or a spiritual or esoteric or hermetic or whatever you want to call it path, at some point they do transcend their place and their time, and they are somehow accessible in a way which is non-conventional. I mean, this is even true just with respect to quote unquote mundane academics, that when a great philosopher passes away or author of fiction literature or whatever, whoever it is, they're somehow put into the eternal present, and you can have dialogues with Plato or whoever it was, or Virgil, as if they were here today. And so I personally tend to see him as part of that subsisting in the eternal present, especially because he did seem to be putting himself outside of his circumstances. But this, at any rate, is some of what we know about his circumstances. And of course, I'm sure he did have a personality and likes and dislikes and, things that got on his nerves and so forth. But those things haven't been preserved.
Both of you touched on the central, I suppose you could say, essence of Al-Buni's work with the Shems, which is that loaded term of magic. And I think this is a really good time to just jump right into it in terms of what is magic. And previous guests, Dr. Liana Saif, Professor Sayed Ahmed, others have talked about, and this is a false dichotomy, but I'll just lay it out here, that there's this concept of sihr, or effectively prohibited magic. We think of the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, and Harut and Marut, and a description of all of the evil things that sihr causes. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's this concept of ruhaniya and this kind of, not theurgistic, maybe that's an inaccurate word, but can I ask both of you, can you lay out some of these terms for the listeners?
Sure. If you're a religious person, magic is whatever your religion doesn't teach.
Okay.
I'm going to actually give an example. It's technically not magic, it's astrology. But I have had this chat with Muslims because, as you know, Islam does use a lunar calendar. For the month of Ramadan, for example, we get very excited to sight the new moon. And there are certain dates on the lunar calendar which are considered to be very special, such as Laylatul Qadr, the night of power, which is going to be essentially one of the moon phases. The full moon nights are in certain months especially are said to be good for worship, like Shaban and so forth. But the point is, this is all essentially according to the visible lunar calendar. So I have sometimes asked some people, what exactly is the difference between that and using a moon phase in astrology or a sun position in astrology? And the answer that usually you do get back is, well, these are the things that are in the Quran and Hadith, or the narrations from the Prophet Muhammad, so they're part of religion, and everything else is not part of religion. So I was being facetious, but I do think that does tend to be how people divide things up, because certainly when you look at things from a religious tradition that you don't adhere to, if there is any sort of, I don't know, theurgy going on, it can seem magical, even if it doesn't seem so to them. Conversely, I might add, one of the soapboxes, I actually got on this soapbox in another book I had to work on. May I make a brief plug for that book? It is, inshallah, forthcoming by Brill in 2022. It's called The Hand of Fatima, the Khamsa in the Arab Islamic Context. So it is about the hand amulets, which a lot of times have 3 fingers up and then equal fingers on the side and an eye in the middle, so for warding off the evil eye and protection and so forth. I actually finished the book on behalf of an author who's deceased, which frankly was a very peaceable agreement. And I would probably not mind working with another deceased author, although Jay was wonderful to work with. But we didn't have any arguments for the book.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're cool. But that was how I got into it. So I would say it was primarily her project, and I just picked it up, obviously, because she was not able to finish it. But one of the things that I did sort of lay into there is, some people will look at anything that's used in religious practice anywhere, including Muslims, as a talisman. So like, is the black stone on the Kaaba a talisman? Or is a necklace with the name of Allah a talisman? People might think these things have spiritual value or there's blessings to have it, but you don't go to someone and say, hey, look at the talisman on the Kaaba and, can I buy that talisman necklace with the name of Allah? It's just not, it's not the way it's perceived. And so I think it's also good to respect how people self-define things. Just because, I wouldn't go to Walmart in the US and say, oh, a Jesus calendar, that's a talisman, because that's not how it's perceived. Basically, what comprises magic is oftentimes in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I guess if one wants to take a sort of historical look, and I am thinking of the concept of magic and not sihr specifically, there is, I think, a connotation of deeper wisdom and esoteric knowledge built into that. But I would say personally, and I'm probably going to be getting another heresy award for this today, that, a rose is a rose by any other name. I don't really get bothered by what someone says. If someone wants to say I'm doing a prayer, fine. Are they doing ruhaniya? Fine. Are they doing sihr? Well, as long as you're not doing it like to me or to someone else, I don't get into that. But of course, sihr is a sensitive word in the Muslim majority world, and it does tend to connotate unjustified malefic acts, oftentimes maybe cheap malefic acts, or there's the connotation of quote unquote unclean spirits. But like, if you look in the verse in the Quran, which you just alluded to, which is really the only verse to deal with the subject of sihr specifically. I mean, there is a running theme in the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad is not a magician and not possessed and so forth, which says something about the society that it came into. And I do think it is easier to understand some parts of the Quran and the Hadith by understanding that it was a society where spirit work was part of the heritage and the culture, and it was something that was known and done for a long time. And from that angle, it's a bit easier to see why the Prophet is constantly saying in the Revelation that I'm not, possessed by a jinn, for example. This is not a jinn speaking, this is God speaking, etc. But the verse about sihr, if to reduce it to its main points, people were tempted to learn the things that are harmful to them or others. They could have learned whatever they wanted, but this is what they wanted to do. It mentions in particular breaking up marriages. Let's be honest. There's a big call for that in the world. Vengeance, love, and breaking up marriages are probably the number ones people deal with. But in any case, so this was what human nature did when they had access to the knowledge, and then they learned the things that harmed them and did not benefit them. There is a word at the end of the verse that I have an opinion on. It says, in the afterlife, they do not have any khalaq. A lot of people will just take that as a surface reading to mean they don't have a place in the hereafter if they've been cursing people and breaking up their marriages. I tend to take that in a bit of a deeper way because, as you know, khalaq is related to the word khalq, meaning the creation of something. Allah is al-khaliq, the creator. And I think it may mean that when someone is throwing around this type of cheap cursing, if you will, and just wreaking havoc, it doesn't have any real permanent reality in the greater or broader metaphysical world, which in the Islamic context would include the afterlife. So, what we do and what we build in this life would have a reality beyond just the material time and place that it subsists in and then passes away. But there's a sense that, sihr is strongly tied to illusion. So it is somehow illusory, it's transient, it doesn't have a grounding. So I take it that from that verse too. So there are some things one gets from that verse, like you shouldn't go around breaking up marriages. People are tempted to learn the wrong stuff. It is part of human nature. I mean, I see that verse kind of as an origin story for magic. Some people, I'm not saying I don't take it literally, because as a Muslim, I do take the Quran literally. But some people take it hyper literally because it refers to these things being learned in Babylon, and that's where magic came from. And there was some plan there for that to happen. I see just more, again, archetypally, that this is how the human being was when this knowledge was available through beings which are not human, angels or shayateen, so malevolent jinn. And this is what we have tended to do with it, rather than sometimes using our best wisdom. I'm not saying everyone would be lacking wisdom, but obviously it happens. So in any case, the concept of sihr does tend to be associated with things that are very harsh and unjustified. And sometimes, to be honest, you do find things that people do. If you actually find the, the physical artifacts of what people are doing, which is really very disturbing. People writing curses on children, or, writing on their photograph they should be getting cancer, and that sort of thing. I mean, that's usually what people think about when they think of sihr. They don't think of metaphysical practice for ascent or enlightenment. That would more be tied in the mystical tradition, and that's where Ruhaniya comes in. I think it's fair to say that many people in the mystical tradition, or even just the prayer tradition, would consider it perfectly justified to wish ill on someone who deserves it, like a tyrant who's torturing people or putting them in prison, and so on and so forth. That this could be a good act because it would save the society. I mean, of course, a godly mystic would pray for the person's guidance, and if that fails, then you pray for them to be offed. But in a sense, I guess it's not an egotistical act. It's an act attempting to carry out the greater good, just like one might have a military force for defense. But those are some slightly rambling nuances on the nature of sihr and the concept of magic. I would definitely emphasize there isn't a one-to-one correspondence in English, and sometimes you get into some misunderstandings because people are trying to match them, or they assume that any sort of spiritual act that has a force is a form of sihr and is somehow prohibited in Islam, which is, not true. I mean, despite all the varying views among Muslims, some spiritual acts are agreed upon to be allowed, and then some there's more opinions about. Sorry, Jay, I interrupted you.
No, you had a lot of really, really great points. I'm just going to try to keep track of them so I could respond to a few of them because they're really good. I think where you started with that is important. Certain political motivations or the magic of other people, or the things that quote unquote other people or other cultures, other religions do. A line that's often repeated to me, and it's a good one, from Peter Gray of Scarlet Imprint, is "You will find the witch at the end of a pointed finger." And it's a good one, not because, we could get into the semantics, and also so much of this is a semantic discussion as well. As Amina mentioned, the language that's being used and how much, credence we give to the use of any particular word to mean a particular thing, and how much we agree upon that as a society that it means that thing. But, once again, we're not necessarily talking about the difference between witchcraft and magic, or even sorcery, which is another word that often gets used as an English translation for sihr, even more than magic oftentimes. But it's more of like the things that other people do that we consider more taboo, and a way of othering, which is oftentimes, whether you want to call it witchcraft, whether you want to call it magic, whether you want to call it sorcery, where these things do come up. And of course, there are political motivations that come out of that and are intermixed with all of the semantic material as well. Who are we trying to conquer? Who are we trying to put down? Who do we feel a little sketchy about the things that they're doing and the way they relate to the things that we're doing? I've heard the term in Arabic pop songs as referring to I was enchanted by this look she gave me. It was like she used sihr on me. I've heard it in so many different contexts in this way, but you could even, the art of applying makeup was brought by the fallen angels anyways. Okay, so this is magic. This is anyways, whatever, right? The look that a beautiful woman gives you with her eyes adorned with beautiful makeup, or this is magic, and you refer back to the tradition in this way. So there's many different ways to look at it. Although I think most people wouldn't listen to the pop song and be like, oh, this is explicitly evil, black magic, the kinds of things that we're trying to parse out. I also think, as someone who's involved in explicitly African and Afro-diasporic traditions, and this is a distinction that I make that a lot of people complain about, but I'm going to clarify why I say it, that I don't use the term black magic. And I have very contemporary reasons for it, not necessarily referring to the historical usage of the term black magic, but because black magic as negative magic or evil magic for many, many people has been used as a term of referring to the magic and religious practices of black people as evil. And so someone who is involved in traditions from Africa, in traditions held together by black people from black cultures, seeing it from within that context, to hear the term black magic and know how it's used, especially in the United States, with a history of slavery, not just the United States having a history of slavery, of course, But once again, the terms that we use, this is all the semantic variability and also the political implications, of course, of the language that we use. So this also applies to so many of the things that we're talking about with the Shams and why it's been considered a banned book or a cursed book. And we're already kind of getting into that same territory, right? To take it even one step further to a Muslim angle, both Amina and I come from a Shia background, the prominent minority group in Islam. And I have heard on so many YouTube videos, so many times in so many different characterizations, how various practices amongst Shia are called magical or are referred to in this way, whether it's things with ta'weez or talismans, whether it's referring to practices on Ashura and different festivals and things like that. And these aren't things that we would even think of as explicitly magical, like conjuring a spirit or something like that. So even in a Muslim context, depending on where you stand with that, right, your religious practices, which could be absolutely very pious and grounded in, once again, things we would consider very religious and not magical, would still be considered by many to be, oh, well, that's just some kind of magical, heretical, what have you, black magical thing. Obviously, there's so many elements to it, and it touches on so many other parts of what we're talking about, and the book itself and the nature of the book itself being a disputed or liminal text in that way. But I don't think you can ignore all of the political implications of our language. Even thinking about the context that we all exist in, whether you live in the United States or whatever, beyond just being a Muslim or just speaking Arabic, right? We can't ignore those things either when you refer to something as black magic, for example.
I think this is a perfect time when we talk about, language and, sihr, ruhaniya, and as you mentioned, the intentionality of those terms. I think this is a perfect time to have you each weigh in on our first listener question for you. And you share in your book, Son of Knowledge, that the Shams al-Ma'arif was, quote, feared, banned, and burned, but also that when a reader opens the book, they find that it is, quote, actually quite pious. And in that context that you lay out, we do have a listener question for both of you from Navdeep Ball. And Navdeep is asking, why does the Shams al-Ma'arif have a reputation of being evil or cursed in the modern Islamic world?
I'll just very briefly respond to that by referencing what I just said. This is going to be my little cop-out on the question and basically refer back to what I just said and then let Amina respond. But yes, I think for all of those same reasons, what one person could open up, perhaps someone with a Sufi background, or even just anyone who's interested in these kinds of things, open up the text and see a beautiful cosmology, right, laid out in this text, this beautiful cosmology where everything is tied to everything else. And you're seeing these celestial spheres connected to the terrestrial spheres and the way these different bodies and mystical bodies are moving through and be completely enamored by this. One person could open up the text and see that. And another person who has perhaps a more rigid framework for religion and spirituality could open up the text and be like, well, this is just black magic, like anything referring even to the planets and the spiritual qualities of the planets. That's just astrology. That's just magic. And so I'm going to write it off. So it's really utterly contextual in that way, depending on where you're looking at it from. One person's pious is another person's heresy.
I think there's a lot of reasons why people are afraid of books like this. It's good to remember that some people just don't want anything to do with the unseen world. They don't want to see ghosts. They don't want to see jinn. They don't want to see things levitate. They don't want any of that. And these are probably not the people listening to the podcast, but that is a good chunk of people. So from that angle, some people just don't want to touch this sort of thing. And there is a common belief in the Muslim world, and I think the belief has some basis, that if you just get this sort of stuff, like you get occult books and you read them, or you spend time with people who do this sort of thing as a profession, then stuff might start happening to you. And there's also a fear that jinn are catching. And to be honest, I do think there's a basis to this too, that if someone, works as an exorcist or they're possessed or whatever, and you're around them enough, then maybe you'll go home with jinn, which I do think it happens. So I do think that these are some of the things. I mean, I'm not saying you guys are going to get possessed or something if you get the book. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that there is a fear of this sort of thing among the people who are not comfortable with it and don't want anything to do with it at all. Of course, these are sometimes the people who end up being the most fascinated with it. Also, there is just fear of the unknown. I mean, it's not necessarily clear to someone who's not really familiar with what's going on in the book what it's about. I mean, you see these numbers and these signs and tables, and what is it? And the nature of the human being is such that many people are afraid of what they don't know, even though we shouldn't be, but that's how we are. I had an interesting conversation with a Muslim exorcist from Bangladesh a couple weeks ago. I'm quite confident he probably will not be listening to the podcast. But he was telling me, because he didn't really know anything about me, and he said, Amina, there's this book you have to be really careful of. Don't get this book. And I'm like, oh, okay, what book? He's like, well, it's called, he's like, I can't remember. It's Mashriq al-Shams, or so I'm like, Shams al-Ma'arif? And he's like, yeah, that one. And then he's like, let me Google it so I can show it to you so you don't get it. And I'm like, no, don't Google, because I thought my picture would come up on Google Images. And just, Google it when you get home. I got the title. I've heard of it before. I know what you're talking about. And, this guy, so I asked him what's wrong with the book. And he said, well, he's never actually read it because it's such a frightening and scary book. But he knows there's horrible things in it. And his friend got it and started to have nightmares. I'm like, okay. I mean, there's worse things in the world than nightmares, I mean, maybe, but don't want to put anyone off, by the way. Hopefully this book will not cause you nightmares. But the point is, ignorance and fear do tend to feed off of each other. And then when you have people telling other people, don't touch this book, it makes it, something really big in people's minds. So, whenever any book is banned. I'd say in the modern era, there's a couple other things. One is the shift in the scientific paradigm. Up until, I guess, the late pre-modern era, that's why we call it the modern era and the pre-modern era, definitely both in Europe and the Islamicate world, the cosmology was, for example, in the time of the celestial spheres, there was a greater importance given to the planets, a certain conception of them as above, so below. Astrology was part of medicine, for example. People may have had varying opinions about the legitimacy or acceptability of astrology, but it wasn't just the idea that, you're so stupid and non-scientific, how can you believe that? And we don't live in a time where we have that cosmology anymore on a mass level. And so there is just a sort of disconnect. It might not make sense to people who are not familiar with the ways of thinking of people a few hundred years ago, which is not really that long ago. And then, of course, you do have the impact of the Salafi and Wahhabi movements, which, for those listeners who are not familiar with them, are the very hyper strict, shall I say, rather intolerant version of Islam that developed in Saudi Arabia and has become very prominent there, and basically sees, really most everything as, they use two words, bid'ah and shirk, so an innovation in religion or associating partners with God. So, these are the people who I would be afraid of violence from if I were to be, in a dark alley with them and this were to come up. But they look at a talisman as, somehow some sort of polytheism. I've never seen anyone worshipping a talisman, but you never know. But the point is, this movement has affected Sunni Islam strongly in the past century. And I do think it does have, it goes part and parcel with the sort of despiritualization and secularization of our cosmology. It is a very dry and literal and very bland form of Islam. I'm probably offending people now, but again, they're probably not the ones listening to the podcast. And so that combined with an attempt to try to scientize Islam and, make everything rational and sort of strip any sort of superstition, that also leads to a certain backlash against or dislike of these things. So there's stuff that's gone on in the modern world that has also made this stuff unacceptable to certain groups of people. While at the same time, I think it's fair to say that in places where a sort of, either heavily secular or, I don't like to use the fundamentalist word because it's such a loaded word, but fundamentalist form of Islam has taken root, I do think we are seeing a shift in that. I mean, even in the United States, where I was visiting a couple years ago, I was really quite surprised to see how mainstream astrology has become. And, for better or for worse, because consumerism is not always a good thing, but seeing all the stuff, going to Target and seeing the astrology signs on the notebooks and the mystical jewelry that's mass produced and stuff, for that, we were talking about the khamsa hand, seeing those all over the place. So, setting aside whether or not excess mass production is a good thing, it was very interesting to me to see this because, certainly 10 or 20 years, it generally was not considered professionally acceptable in most places and professions to talk about astrology or tarot cards or this sort of thing. And nowadays people are talking about the Mercury retrograde. Of course, I don't want to take one place and project it on the rest of the world, but I've heard there is a resurgence of astrology in China, for example, and other places as well. So it does seem we are heading as a species into a bit more of a mystical moment after a very heavy push of materialism.
Real quick, I do like the point about fear and the things that feed on fear. I think people forget that a lot, that there are spirits and not spirits that feed on fear and shock and all of this kind of thing. And of course, we've had shock rockers and artists and everything who thrive in this same kind of thing, who understand that to shock people and make people afraid, whether it's horror, all this sort of stuff, can actually be quite profitable. I was musing on this picture of the Shamsama Arif that I think was on Liana Saif's Twitter page of the Ghait al-Hakim, the kind of like occult, pulp, theosophical looking aesthetic with it. And I remember the first thing I'm really thinking about is the commercial exchange is the first thing that really thrives from all of this, right? That people being afraid of it. And then, as you said, in interacting with the text in that same vein, out of a place of exoticism and everything else. And I mean, of course, if you're interacting with a spiritual text and then getting spiritual phenomena out of it, it's yes, that's what's supposed to happen. Don't read it or don't open it if you don't want that. Don't open up a cookbook if you're not interested in cooking, you're going to cook something. But also, if people continue with the sort of it's the fear and the horror of it, then those are the same people, as you said, Amina, which I thought was a great point of I'm going to go right to the jinn sections and I'm going to take in all the really naughty stuff first, because those are the things that I've been forbidden from, and in the way I was raised and in my culture and everything else. And that's just kind of a bad way to start off any relationship, I think. So I like the point about fear. It's very much true.
Yeah. And actually, to follow both of your points regarding fear and misunderstanding, what's so ironic is when you open up your book, for example, the first 8 chapters and then excerpts from 17 and 19 of the Shams al-Ma'arif, there are names in there, for example, that any person of the Muslim faith would agree with. Ar-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Rahim. And this is a great time, I think, to discuss some of the content of the book. And 2 of the big kind of areas, just broadly speaking, that I'd love to have you both weigh in on are the employment by al-Buni in the Shams of the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also the great number 28. There are 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. These are divided up into the 4 elements. So can you tell us about the names of God and the prominence of the Arabic alphabet?
Sure. Oftentimes in Islamic theology, the 99 names of Allah or the 99 names of God are spoken of. And they do feature in the book. There are a great number beyond the 99, which do appear here and there in various texts, but that's another matter. We can start with 99 anyway. The name of Allah itself, God, is considered to have a lot of power in and of itself, whether it's uttered, or whether it's written or inscribed and so forth. Even if one is not attempting to do any sort of quote unquote occult thing. So for example, someone might put up on the wall a wall hanging of the 99 names of Allah as a protective piece, but without going through the occult ritual. So not consecrating it or doing it at a special time or whatever, because these names are held to have power. Arabic is held to be a sacred language and oftentimes held to come from the heavens, similar to conceptions of Hebrew. In fact, the languages are quite similar and viewpoints about them are similar. I'm in favor of the idea of the divine revelation of Arabic simply because the grammar is so complicated. But one never knows. So in any case, one of the things the book does outline is some very practical uses of the divine names. Because of course, one might just meditate on the divine names for edification or worship because they enjoy them. And in fact, it's said in mystical circles that the human being does manifest the names of God. And so, a mystical teacher or a Sufi teacher might prescribe that you recite a certain name of God regularly, perhaps a certain number of times to instill or build or balance a certain attribute inside yourself. So there is an idea that interacting with the names of Allah, if done with focus and intention, will actually change the human being, or conversely, it can imbalance the human being if done wrong. I did keep one footnote in the book about that for those who found it. At least one person has found it because they told me. But in any case, this is just, I guess, not what I would consider to be occult practice. This is just mystical practice. But yeah, there are some more targeted uses. So, for example, inheritance. The book suggests that if you wish to receive inheritance from one of your relatives, you recite the name of Allah, the inheritor, al-warith, frequently. So, there's a concordance that this is one of the divine names, al-warith, and then you are imbuing yourself with that capacity in order to produce a material result. Or there's various different types of applications given for them. The name An-Nur, the light, it can be recited simply to illuminate your heart. So again, a sort of obvious concordance for spiritual use, that you meditate on divine light and the name associated with it, and it would illuminate your heart. I've heard of that being done also to develop, whatever you wish to call it, psychic perception, third eye perception, etc. But if you recite it along with the name, the beneficial and nafi', then it should heal any ailment or pain caused by cold. So that's maybe a little bit less obvious. I mean, nur, light is associated with fire. So from that angle, perhaps there is a concordance there. And then along the same lines, in that same section, he gives a talisman that you can write out and then wash off with a liquid and feed it to the person who's suffering, which is comprised of names, letters, and numbers. And then that also would ideally send the beneficial aspects of that name to the person. So basically, there are ways the names are used, and some of them are simple, just recite it or recite it a certain number of times. And I would consider that to be a sort of broader practice outside of the occult tradition. I mean, in Sufism, it's quite common. Some Muslims will accept it, and the stricter ones might not necessarily, unless it's very clearly prescribed in hadith. But it is something that's commonly done. Once you get into the writing of talismans or engraving of talismans, or do this when the moon is in Scorpio or during Venus hour, then I would start to put that more in the occult practices section. Not the least because it requires some sort of specialized knowledge that a layperson might not have necessarily. Although, of course, there's still going to be blurry lines. So basically, yeah, the names are being used to do stuff. So if one wants to make a very broad generalization about Al-Buni versus Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi is largely, although not entirely, but largely about mysticism for the mystical, and Al-Buni is largely, but not entirely, about mysticism to get stuff done. So this book is more about getting stuff done, even though it also does contain various scaffoldings for the spiritual ascension of the human being. And, there's a lot of stuff in it. There's stuff about spiritual cosmology and what color are things in these celestial spheres and what do you find in them. But what the book is known for is that it does give you instructions. And then some of the instructions are more complicated than others.
I was just going to say, I do like that this is kind of a continuation of the same semantic linguistic thing that we've been talking about of like, what is considered magic? What isn't? Well, it's the name of God. A lot of people would say it's not magic because it's the name of God, but some would say it is. You could have similar conversations around the use of Psalms from the Bible and other traditions, for example. And we're sort of riding that same line once again between, is it pious? Is it magic? Like, if it's the name of God, do we call it magic? And I love that the book does partake of that weird liminal space in between once you think about it. Similarly, and having two of the names of God, there is a chapter on Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is also heavily emphasized, the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim being used to begin journeys, to begin things. We might have used it to begin the podcast, this kind of thing. and also has all its own esoteric correspondences being able to be broken down into 7, as well as the different letters and their particular correspondences and meanings that Al-Buni gets pretty extensively into in the text. One of the things to kind of respond to the names of God and their importance and why this magic is efficacious, I think, is there is this notion of the dot at the bottom of the letter B or B, oftentimes attributed to Imam Ali, and all things because the Quran begins with the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and begins with that letter. All things in the Quran emerge from the single dot or point at the bottom of the letter. And I think you can think about the names as well as the letters in the same way. And I've been likening it to this great divine sweater, if you will. And the names, and in particular the letters, but we can even get into the dot signatures as being the constituent parts of this divine sweater. And the magic works, right? Or as Amina was saying, this is practical because once you dial into what's happening here, when you dial into the language, you know what letter, you know what name to tug on that sweater, the little thread, the khat, the khayt, the lines and the threads that make up this sweater to elicit a certain response or a certain reaction. And this is why the Shams al-Ma'arif is so much more than just a book or what we'd call a book of magic or even a grimoire, because it has this cosmology, this very orderly cosmology to it, wherein the magic works because it partakes of this cosmology. It isn't just a book of spells as we would think about it in that way. And I do think it's important to mention that, not only for context around the book itself or why people might call it a pious text or think of Al-Buni as a pious person, but also why the magic works, right? Like these things are not considered mutually exclusive as they oftentimes are. You can tug on the alif over here and elicit certain responses and a different letter here and so on and so forth. And of course, the letters make up the names, right? And then the dots make up the letters. This is also something that's well attested to in Arabic calligraphy. This is something that has been spoken about by Sufi mystics. I wrote about it in the introduction to the Shams in relationship to Al-Halaj, speaking about it. But in calligraphy, this comes up again, right? The dot, which becomes the line, and the line, the khat, the khayt, the thread or the line. And then those lines or those threads become the letters, which become the names. And the names, there are more than 99 when it comes down to it, right? They all form this divine pattern.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, ultimately, as in other traditions, this seems to be grounded in the idea that God uttered creation into existence,
Exactly.
that the divine word was what spoke us into being. So presumably, if one can align oneself with the godhood and utter some things into being, then one can, for all intents and purposes, carry out the same creative or destructive act. I guess that perhaps this might be the root of the difference between ruhaniya, or whatever you want to call it, pious magic, and sihr, the impious magic, that the ruhaniya practitioner would be attempting to align themselves wholly with divinity, and then when they utter their words of creation or destruction, even if it's just nur nafi' to cure someone who's ill or whatever, they're doing so while aligning themselves with God and removing themselves, whereas perhaps the sorcerer might be presenting themselves as a false god. So, for example, telling the unclean spirits who don't know any better, I am your god. Of course, that's a very gross generalization because there's all sorts of ways people approach things, but that might be a sort of philosophical approach or thematic difference. But in any case, what one is aligning oneself with some sort of broader power that utters and causes things through letters, really, but also numbers being inherently part of the natural world as well.
Separating it from intention, though, as well. I love the divine sweater. I cherish the divine sweater. I just want to say, though, at the beginning of the text, there's content about essentially cursing or destroying people with the letter aleph, or things likened to the letter aleph. Also, there's al-ahmar and other the planet Mars and whatnot that are also there. But it's like, okay, you could still be, as I said, dialed into this whole schema of language and the divine language and all that. But, if your intention is to destroy someone, are we going to call it sihr? Are we going to call it black magic? Depending on your purpose, even if you're using the divine language in this instance, right? I think it becomes, once again, it goes back into that liminal place of how are we defining these things. I did want to respond to the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet and the lunar mansions because you had asked about it. And I think it's an important point. Amina said something really funny in response when I think we were first asked about this, which was, it's a match made in heaven. I love that. I find that funny and cute and also kind of true. But I see it as the same connection to imagination. I know I haven't used the term imagination, but that's a big part of the work that I do and my interest in a lot of this. And also why I felt that I needed to illustrate certain parts, specifically the bits on the lunar mansion, and that there needed to be artwork. But some things are similar or like other things, and human beings make correspondences, and we have poetry, and this person is like this flower, is like this beautiful night sky, so on and so forth. And these are the kinds of things that we do. And I think just like people relate the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to different things and Kabbalah and Hermeticism and whatnot, this is a similar thing that we do with the lunar mansions because the numbers work out with each other. In the Vedic tradition, there's 27 for the most part, not exactly the same. You could include certain Arabic letters or disinclude them, as well as different authors have different letter correspondences for different mansions. This is not something that always, Aleph is right at the beginning of Aries, this initiating force we tend to think of it as. I think people raised in a lot of the Western Hermetic material think of correspondences as static, almost as like there is one set of correspondences and it is 777 and that is the only set. I'm obviously having a little bit of fun, but there is a static quality to it, which in the Arabic material and in, I think, most magical material, these correspondences can be much more loose, can be much more fluid, can vary per author. So Ibn Arabi, we've been talking about him a lot as well. He has different letter correspondences for the lunar mansions. There's still 28 Arabic letters, but they're entirely different from Al-Buni. And so in that same way, I think it comes down to what I'm calling the imagination of the author or the person who is coming to the material to say, well, actually, I don't see this Hebrew letter as relating to this particular tarot card, or I see a different one. Or I don't see this Arabic letter as relating to this particular lunar mansion. I see a different one. Or I don't see it at all. The schema doesn't make sense to me at all, and I'm going to do something different completely. There was a lot of this happening with comparisons between the lunar mansions and the Ramel figures, the 16 geomantic or Ramel figures. Like, okay, which one corresponds to which? And different authors are going to say different things about it. But fundamentally, those correspondences largely are coming from the actual appearance of the stars themselves and the way that these dot diagrams that authors have made, what the constellations might look like. And then just looking at the image of it in the same way you would look at the image of an Arabic letter. And what does this image evoke for you? This is, to me, beginning to talk about image magic, which maybe is for another time. But the Arabic letters and letters in general are images. They have shape, they have form, they have sound. And all of these things together, depending on who you are and how you're looking at it, are going to form what they are more alike. So maybe Aleph is more like Aries because it has this vertical quality as a letter compared to other Arabic letters, which have more of a horizontal nature, right? Aleph is shooting up into the sky and down into the ground. It takes on this kutub axis-like nature. And so we see it as being most like Aries because it is a kind of initiating, begins the alphabet, and Aries begins the zodiac. Well, okay, The lunar mansions, it didn't always begin with Aries. The lunar mansions didn't even begin with the zodiacal signs in the first place as it is. So once again, how are you looking at it? What is your set of correspondences? It's always going to vary, I think, and it should vary. And also, what is the imaginative process that's at work? Because some of the way these things are decided, the correspondences, are actually just based on what the letter looks like. What is the phase of the moon, and does it look like this Arabic letter, right? Like Dal kind of looks like a certain phase of the moon a little bit, has this curved quality, could be thought of as a kind of a crescent shape, almost bordering on a crooked C. These are the kinds of things that the people who are writing these books are talking about and doing, but it isn't a static system. I think it's just very important to emphasize that.
Now, let me just interject here, because I think you might have just answered this talking about the fluidity and how it's not a static system, but we do have a listener question for you both from Martin Mudd, who is asking, I'm curious about the various assignments of the 28 Arabic letters to the 28 lunar mansions. There appears to be a discrepancy between the assignments I've read in the Shams al-Ma'arif and what's printed on the mansion images in the appendix to the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim by Greer and Warnock. How did the Islamic sages decide such assignments, Martin is asking. And Jay, as you were saying, and Dr. Inloes, it sounds like that fluidity was based on whoever was putting the material down. Is that somewhat fair?
I would agree with the fluidity idea, while at the same time, I don't think everything is seen as being fluid. There is a very clear idea in this book that the letters pre-existed before creation. They have some position with the divine, some metaphysical reality. They have inherent characteristics that relate to them. So I wouldn't say everything is fluid, but yeah, there are multiple methods of assigning them to the mansion. I have to say, what was the listener's name again?
The listener's name is Martin Mudd.
Yes,
M-U-D-D.
Martin Mudd.
It's a lot
well
of memes.
Spotted.
That's a lot of memes, right? A lot of M's. That's its
and
own.
Dolls too.
You see how that goes? That name evokes a certain. The meme is a and Al-Buni talks about it in relation to a bell or musical instruments and Israfil I believe Israfil in the Shams al-Ma'arif, and this is exactly what we're talking about, right? Like you look at these, and of course, some authors are just going to copy what other authors wrote. Granted, like I'm not saying that every single person who approaches this is going to undergo the same heavily imaginative thing. Some people are just going to copy what is already there, of course. But I think if we're talking about the correspondences that really were juicy, again, the juicy ones, Ibn Arabi, Al-Buni, this kind of thing is more at work. And I'm really fascinated by the concept of al-qalam or the pen in this tradition, and see these letter forms emerging out of, I called it in my introduction to the text, the archaic language of the moon, because through the lunar phases, the moon is creating images through this play between darkness and light. And this is a kind of language, if you will. And so through the auspices of the moon, let's say, the 28 lunar mansions in this way, it's a kind of language that God in this cosmology is inscribing on the earth. And this is how the kalam is thought to be in this way, the process of inscription, which I think lends itself to talisman creation and so many things. But in thinking about the relationship between the language and the lunar phases and the lunar mansions, this is the kind of thing that is at work. These images that the moon is showing us, right? And, oh, well, that's kind of like that Arabic letter. That's kind of like that thing. This is al-qalam inscribing onto the cosmos, the language that is the cosmos, right? The divine language.
But there's also a lot of detail work going on. I'm going to say 99.9% of people probably would not have noticed that. And I certainly never noticed it either. So points for Martin Mudd, right? This book is very easy. The sequence is in the old order of the Arabic alphabet, or the Abjad sequence, the sequence that goes with the numerical values of the Arabic letters, so alif, ba, jim, dal, and so forth. The sequence the Arabic alphabet is usually used in today is slightly different. So this is the more fundamental or foundational order, if you will. So we start with alif and just go through the alphabet. And this is a very common method of assignment. I am given to understand that Christopher Warnock and the person who was drawing the images did use the assignments found in a book called Mystical Astrology of Ibn Arabi, which a very dear friend gave me a number of years ago, by Titus Burckhardt. Unfortunately, Mr. Burckhardt has been deceased for, I think, about 30 or 40 years, so we cannot directly get him on the line without a seance to discuss it. However, someone did once tell me that, as Jay was saying right now, that Ibn Arabi does indeed use the assignments in the mystical astrology of Ibn Arabi in one of his books, and it's a phonetic arrangement. So he starts with Alif, Ha, Ain, Ha, Ghain. So instead of being the abjad or the numerical order of the alphabet, it goes through it phonetically, and that Ibn Arabi also mentions there's a special arrangement for the one who knows the mystical knowledge, the arif, and then there's an even more special arrangement of correspondences for the elites, the super Gnostic people. I do have to credit my friend who's more of a specialist in Ibn Arabi than I am for sharing those points. But yeah, basically they are different sources. I do feel like systems tend to be self-consistent. Even if, for example, there may be fluidity or there may be variations between systems, but they tend to work in and of themselves, and that's why they are the way they are. For example, lunar mansions are a little bit different in Vedic astrology, but they've got different rules and things are self-consistent. But that being said, I'm sure if someone wished to make some of the images from Warnock's book and substitute these correspondences in, it would probably be fine. Or you could use the original, out of respect to the artist. But in short, that is the difference. But that is an excellent question.
I mean, even in the traditional abjad sequence, moving from the new moon to the full moon, the new moon is given to Aleph, which is the open mouth, and then the full moon is given to Mim, the closed right? So the new moon, the open mouth, the full moon, the closed mouth, divine language.
And speaking of language, and this kind of, goes to that theme about language and what does this mean? Let's talk a little bit about, and we have a listener question for you from Bilal. And Bilal is asking and saying, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you both for your translation efforts. Alhamdulillah. And Bilal says, I'm curious about the obscure language in the Shams al-Ma'arif. Was it intentional that, quote, tedium and vexation are the bane of the student so that no one could work with the Shams al-Ma'arif unless guided by a master? Shukran. Thank you, Bilal says.
I don't think so. I think it's probably more referring to the discipline required for this entire art. Simply reading the book is less work, if you will, than actually doing the sort of training one might be expected to do, which might be all sorts of things. One might be expected to fast for certain periods of time, or give up certain things in life, go on retreats, do certain acts of worship, or do things at very strict periods of time. Extremely long recitations are quite common in this tradition. Recite this 1,000 times. Well, I don't know, recite it 10,000 times and just keep going. So I think that, of course, there is a certain discipline required in learning. And some of these things there's layers of complexity. To say recite this name of Allah or this Quranic verse this number of times to accomplish something is easy to put in the brain. But if you want to talk about the framework of astrology or some of the in-depth methods of talisman construction and so forth, that gets much more complicated. And you do have to focus, like learning anything else. Like, we were talking about cooking or algebra or calculus, computer programming, whatever it is. It can be tedious, if you will. I know someone in this field, if you will, that's their description of jinn summoning, that it's tedious because it's long and doesn't always work. And you just do it again and you do it again and do it again, like any sort of art or sport or endeavor until you get it right. I don't think it's necessarily something to push someone away from the text itself, but just that, as in any other culture with a very serious sort of esoteric or occult practice, you do have to put in a lot of work to be considered competent.
A lot of that tedium, especially in the repetition of certain names, once again, this kind of thing, can bring on, in a very mantric way, bring on trance states and induce these kinds of states through repeating things again. So there's a technical quality there as well. It's also about the kind of states that emerge out of repeating the same thing again and again and again and again in the same way. You know, drone music or house music does the same kind of repetition of the rhythm to induce these kinds of states. That's definitely a quality, as well as you mentioned, disciplinary quality that comes with a lot of this. And there are structures of these arts. Amina mentioned astrology, but also, if you're not familiar with the Arabic language, learning the different linguistic components, of course, knowing about the Quran, obviously, as well as, I think, just doing your due diligence with this intact cosmological framework that we've been touching on again and again, because at least in my mind, the magic is efficacious for largely that reason. And that does take some work on the part of the reader. And I think even people who belong to Sufi lineages don't necessarily have that through initiation. You do still have to interact with, just for clarification, I do not belong to a Sufi lineage. Similar to Amina, I am interacting with the text through my own engagement, not through a teacher or a master murshid in this way. But I want to say that even if you have that, and even if you have initiations, you still have to engage with it. I don't think this is just given to you through initiation. Perhaps you might comprehend it better than the average person looking at it.
And to be honest, and I'm sure you guys will probably agree, in this day and age, there isn't a lot of space for tedium and vexation. I mean, before the internet was around, or back when learning styles were a bit more, shall we say, sparse, and you just got your textbook with no pictures and, read the book and learn it, or just, write down notes when the professor is droning or whatever, and just get it together. And that was the learning process. It was indeed very tedious. And, I'm all for the advances in education, which try to make it exciting and interesting. But at the same time, because we have so much stimulation today, and if you have a smartphone and an internet connection, you don't necessarily, you can opt out of boredom. That discipline isn't always there, which is one reason I think some of the most successful people don't use any sort of social media and so forth. Of course, you guys are exceptions, and you're using your social media, and I'm on it too. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that sometimes having the immediate stimulus, you will, of things catching your attention and filling empty space does take away from the long extended study or focus on something.
As I mentioned at the beginning, there are spirits around the text, and the book is alive in itself too. And to dedicate yourself seriously in that way, it also shows those same beings that you are taking this seriously, that you're not a dabbler, right? And that's something that people oftentimes don't talk about. But like, okay, you seem very serious about this. Actually, let's open up the relation, just like in any relationship, right? Like, you're just stopping through and seeing what's up real quick, and then you're about to dip. It's like, okay, well, you're actually not that serious about this, so we're not going to go to any level of depth with this. So you are engaging with things that are alive, right? And this is real stuff. Of course, I shouldn't have to say that, but yeah, and taking that kind of dedication, and in moving through the tedium, you're also showing all those other non-corporeal things around it. Like, okay, I'm actually serious about this, right?
In fact, to that very point, we do have some practical questions for you both as well, with questions from listeners. And many listeners are familiar, especially paging through, for example, like the European grimoire tradition, about this concept of astrological timing. And, the moon must be waxing, for example, and perhaps the planetary day and hour is very important. And so to all of that, we have a listener question for you both from Cabra. And Cabra is asking, what is the view in the Shams al-Ma'arif about astrological timing for workings?
It comes up prominently with things based on our familiar zodiacal signs. As Amina mentioned, when the moon is in Scorpio, do this. When the sun is here, similar to what a lot of people might be familiar with the Ghayat al-Hakim. that level of astrological timing, although not nearly as complex, for one. One of the things people ask us a lot about is the distinctions between the Ghaid al-Hakim or the Picatrix and the Shams al-Ma'arif, which is its own podcast and everything else. But one of the primary distinctions is that the Shams al-Ma'arif is much more grounded in the Quran, is much more grounded in Islam as a religion, in that theology, in that cosmological thinking, as well as we've talked about, Arabic letters, names of God, so on and so forth. Whereas the Ghaid al-Hakim has some of that, of course, but is much more of like capital A astrology being the primary thing going on there. But those kinds of, when this planet is in this sign, that comes up quite a bit. Of course, the lunar mansions, as you mentioned, figures prominently in it. The planetary hours are another thing that there's a whole fleshed out section that comes up. So planetary hours, planets in particular signs. You don't see anything about conjunctions with stars as far as I know. That doesn't really come up, although there is a large section on stars, and stars figure more, I think, with the lunar mansions, because people forget, but it is the case that the lunar mansions emerge out of bodies of star lore. The lunar mansions are actually more about stars than they are about the moon. The stars are largely related to the lunar mansions, and there is a large section on the stars in our selected translation. But can you think of anything else, Amina, that's very, very astrological, explicit?
Yeah, that pretty much covers it. The section on the planetary days are referenced anyway, and then there are specifications for what to do or not to do during certain planetary hours. And the lunar mansions as well. There's a general idea in this tradition, which is just having a good or bad hour. So like good acts, you might do it, say, in the sun hour or Venus hour. And I mean, I don't want to just do moral judgments, but I put it this way. Benefic acts you do then. If you want to attack someone or curse someone, maybe do it during Saturn hour. So, you do things in the concordant times. And then there are some things that are specified. So, for example, if you wish for protection against scorpions, you have a set of numbers. You write them, or probably inscribe them, on a piece of copper, then heat it in the fire while the moon is in Scorpio. So we're, obviously as above, so belowing there. And when the moon is in an unfortunate astrological aspect with Mars. And then after that, you dip it in water and drink the water. So that's the sort of thing which is specific, and in this case, very specific to what one is trying to accomplish, because otherwise, generally, it's, moon in Scorpio is considered not a nice time for doing most things. So there's specifics, and then there's generals. One of the points he mentions very briefly is that you don't need to observe astrological timing for workings if they only involve letters, but if they involve numbers, you should observe astrological timings. That's, of course, a generalization, but with relating to the metaphysical substance of letters and numbers.
This might be a great chance to talk about the role of angels. And when we think of Mikhail and Jibril, for example, in the chapter on astrological timing that you present in the Shams al-Ma'arif, the Jinn King, Ahmar, the red, and the angel, Samsa'il, are both associated with the first lunar mansion and the first Arabic letter Aleph. So in that light, what is the general relationship presented in the Shams between the Jinn Kings and the angelic rulers of each day of the week?
Yeah, for every day of the week, there is a corresponding big angel and a Jinn King. So they all go together. And yes, you do call upon the authority of the angels or invoke the authority of the angels to increase your authority to call upon the Jinn King, which is a very large and important being, not to be taken lightly. So it is part of exerting divine authority. In general, now I'm sure someone's going to be popping out exceptions left and right. Please put them on social media. But in general, Muslims don't tend to have a lot of procedures for invoking angels on their own. Like, I'm going to invoke the Archangel Gabriel, or I'm going to channel Gabriel. There's sort of a sense they are too high for that. I mean, there are procedures for invoking some angels, sometimes lesser angels. the authority is called upon, or you dress yourself in their authority, if you will, but they usually tend to be associated with something else, or like written around the edge of a talisman to give it authority and power and so forth. That is quite common to have angels mentioned when evoking jinn kings or other jinn.
There's a lot of mixture as well. Oftentimes you see long conjurations that invoke angelic names as well as jinn names, and the correspondence is less one-to-one in that sort of thing. Less in the Shams al-Ma'arif, but in a lot of other Arabic magical texts, you will see jinns invoked without the angelic correspond, or you'll see, the four chiefs or other jinns referenced in other texts. I don't think that's as common in the Shams al-Ma'arif. You tend to get them together more often than not. Oftentimes, it feels like more of a mixture as opposed to, I think, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but there's this concept in one of the Western grimoires, the Ham Farash, or the thwarting angels. When you do the angel to the jinn is the same as like angel to the demon of the Goetia. And I don't think it's that, or most of it does not come off in that same, like, you always have to balance the other with the other one. So it oftentimes comes off as more of like a mixture of these different beings rather than always this one-to-one correspondence.
Yeah, but I think to some degree that is covering all your bases or trying to balance the various octaves of power. Like even if you look at some of the invocations in this book, you've got the divine names, you've got the angels, you've got the jinn kings, you might have some other jinn of questionable nature. So you're calling on a lot of aspects of things which are sort of envisioned as inhabiting various layers of creations, I guess, to give it a full thrust of power, not to leave anything out. I mean, even the famous conjuration that's become quite well known nowadays, the Burhatia, it also calls upon all of the high spirits and all of the low or the under spirits. So we're not leaving anything out there. And God.
To that point, that it applies at almost every level, wherein the letter, I've even seen the Fatiha broken down into these 7 parts, and then the 7 parts of the Fatiha are ascribed to a particular planetary intelligence, right? You can do the same thing with the Bismillah. And so you can break it down in all these different ways and then ascribe that to the angel and then the jinn at the same time, or just the angel or just the jinn, once again, depending on what you're doing. And the Arabic letters as well. For example, the letter Sheen, which is associated with fire, Samsama'il and Al-Ahmar in the same way, the letter. And then you see Aleph at the beginning of the text also being related to Ahmar and the planet Mars and Samsama'il. So the letters as well, right? It's not just in the conjurations, but even in the letter correspondences, in the astrological correspondences, you see this layering that happens where, as Amina said, you're covering all your bases. So the letter is like from the high to the low.
And to that point, there's another question too about many listeners are very familiar with grimoiric prescriptions to fast before a ritual, to purify, to go to confession, to pray. Can you share about the importance of ritual fasting and monastic behavior, but not really monastic behavior in this sense? What must one do to prepare before they engage with any kind of, letters, numbers, or even the evocation of jinn?
Well, of course, it's going to vary based on what you were doing. If every person ever who wrote a talisman were going on a 40-day retreat and a long fast and so forth, we wouldn't have very many talismans. I mean, these things are considered to be ideal, but some things are considered to be more requiring of it than others. But yeah, there's a general idea, and in some cases it is specified, including in different parts of the book, that you should retreat from society, preferably somewhere in the natural world, and focus entirely on your work. And fasting is often mentioned as well. I think there's a few things going on there. One of the things that's very simple and basic, that in places in the modern world where people might live in small families or have a certain amount of space from their neighbors and so forth, we might sort of take for granted, but for people who have been to the Middle East or North Africa, and especially in the previous generations, but even nowadays, there isn't really much of a concept of personal space. And I want my privacy is not necessarily always a nice and socially acceptable thing to say. And a lot of people are living with extended family. And, even if they're not your kids, you probably have someone's kids running around in the house. And that's not really the ideal environment for doing something, with hours of extended focus, apart from the fact that, if people get into like summoning jinn and stuff, they may not wish to do that with children in the household. So I think there is actually something very practical going on there. But apart from that, obviously to focus yourself entirely on the task. I think not to have, either other people, I don't want to sound all, new agey, but, other people's energies interfering or other people's issues. I think also just on a practical level, some of the stuff is very intense. And if you're trying to do your 8 to 5 day job and then deal with your family issues and, socialize, and then you sit down to do your jinn summoning or you're working, it's tough to keep that up regularly, day after day, or something that you do and say split 5 times throughout the day or 6. At some point, the human being will drain their energy. So I think the idea is just to keep it in so that you have more focus on what you're doing. Some people would probably say it, and I think there's truth to this, that also just being away from quote unquote civilization helps a bit with getting spiritual stuff to happen. That might not be happening in an apartment building in London or New York, for example, even if it can. But, there's something different, especially if you're going in the desert.
Don't put your apartment down, Amina.
It's interesting. But in any case, getting out of the city for people in the city. So I think those are some of the main things behind it.
A lot of the same stuff. I just like repeating names and phrases again and again. Fasting can obviously put you this is like a technical approach, I guess, and wouldn't be phrased in this way. It can put you in a state of mind. So there's this ritual purity, but also an openness, right? In the same way that you're not taking in food, you more easily recognize things that are coming in because you're not taking in other things, and your body isn't. Even from like a physical lens, you're not spending all this energy on digestion and all this other stuff. But I think especially for engaging with the spookier elements, the mindset tends to be ritual purity and fasting and cleanliness and making sure that you're right with God and with your priest and your church and all this stuff, as you mentioned. Those things tend to go along. Like you will be better able to handle things that are, for lack of a better term, more dangerous. I'm not trying to be relativistic about it. Some elements of this are more dangerous than other elements of it. So, and I think this is largely the case, right? Like ritual purity, cleanliness, fasting, once again, maybe a vegetarian diet, what have you, allows for you to better engage with those sorts of things too.
One note, with respect to confession, most Muslims, or I gotta call it the standard Islamic view or whatever, is that you're not actually supposed to verbally confess what you've done wrong. The idea is it's between you and God, and if you were to tell someone about it, you might encourage it or make it normalized to them. So it's good to clean up your relationship between yourself and God, but you're supposed to keep it private. There may be exceptions that apply. However, that's a minor detail.
Oftentimes people are drinking a lot of letters, and we're talking about names of God. And if you're writing in ritually consecrated ink, verses of the Quran on the inside of a consecrated bowl and everything else, it helps if you haven't been eating anything, right? If the magical act is to drink the ink down, to drink the names of God into your body, if your body is, cleared out of other things, it makes sense that you'd more easily absorb, let's say.
This actually leads to a few questions that I know many listeners are familiar with in other contexts, but again, your wonderful presentation of the Shams al-Ma'arif really is connecting the dots. And one of those is one of the evocations that you share about in the Shams, quote, presumes that the evoker is calling the spirits into a scrying mirror, unquote. Can you share about just your thoughts, each of you, on the concept of scrying in general in Islamic esotericism? Was it common in the Shams, or was it common outside of that? Or were there other scrying implements that were used instead of just a mirror? Just any thoughts you have on that?
One thing about this sort of book is it assumes that people know the basics or have the basics sorted out. And I find that's oftentimes quite common in modern discussions. So there isn't like a how-to section on how to scry or what it might mean, since that I guess if someone is going to use the technique, they learned it and got it together. And if they didn't need to use it, then that's fine too. In this particular evocation, it did specifically say a mirror. So it's just simply through illusion that the evoker is saying something along the lines of come into my mirror, that you actually understand they have a reflective substance. It would require some digging through historical occult text to really draw a timeline of what appears when, and there may be someone that's done that or who's doing that, and that's great. Put it on social media. I don't know everything. I would say the main techniques that do tend to come up historically is putting ink on the palm, which makes sense because, before the Industrial Revolution, you have less stuff. It's just easier to get ink and color your palm and stare at it. Borrowing children and having children scry on your behalf is also quite common. I've seen mirrors in other texts, but I don't recall offhand, like what is the century or whatever. So those are two of the main techniques that come up. I would guess this sort of thing, looking into reflective or surfaces that you can kind of lose yourself into, crystal ball, whatever, a bowl of water, lake, is probably just, it's known to have been done in the ancient world, and it's just probably the sort of thing that was done, but not necessarily verbalized a lot, at least not in this, particular sort of manual. Like, it also doesn't say this is how you pick up and hold a bamboo reed pen, for example, but someone who's been raised with ballpoint pens might indeed need some instructions on how to sharpen their reed pen or how to cut it and so forth to dip into their saffron ink. So I think it's sort of a tacit skill that's generally assumed, except in cases where there is an instruction in the procedure. Like I said, where children, for example, are specifically referenced. Using a medium for contact with spirits, and I mean medium in the sense of a physical object, not like a medium person, is also the idea that you can call the jinn into your hand and get the jinn to move your hand to get answers to things, which is a little bit creepy, but that appears sometimes too in texts. Jay, do you want to add?
No, I think that covers most of what I would have said. Just like Talisman, I like to take maybe a broader approach on what scrying could be or is. And I think that reflective surfaces, things of that nature are for sure. But I also think people could scry letters. I think text can be scried, letters can be scried. Once again, image and a broader perspective on what image could be. I think with Ramal and making marks in the sand or in dirt, I think this can also be a form of scrying as well. This act of marking in the sand. I would also call it scrying. That's all that I'll add.
Yeah, and in terms of popular practice, I would consider someone reading tea leaves or coffee grounds to be a lighter form of scrying. It's not as intense as like staring at a mirror and waiting for the spirit to appear or something, but they're looking at something and trying to find some pattern in it and trigger something in their knowledge of what is beyond to say something meaningful. Whether it is meaningful or not is another matter, but nonetheless, it is it's the same sort of thing that, again, it's done, but it's not necessarily explained out usually. It's just kind of someone's doing it.
This kind of goes back to your wonderful presentation in the Shems about timing in general and the division of the year. One of the things that kind of dropped off right before and after the Renaissance in the European grimoire tradition is this calling of the spirits of the season and of the sun and of the moon and of the earth and specific occult names for each season. In the Shems Ma'arif, what is the importance of the four seasons and how is the year divided into not only seasons, but into directions and directionality and spatial relationships?
Establishing directionality I see as similar to the divine sweater that I mentioned earlier, of establishing the order of the cosmos. So then you can kind of dial into what thread you want to pull on, right? But you have to establish what that sweater, the structure of that sweater first, before you can start tugging on different things. In astrological traditions, the world over, there is this strong emphasis on the directionality and the spirits of those directions. And before workings are done, before prayer is given, appealing to those same spirits of the directions in the same manner of like establishing the structure of the cosmos is extremely important. So I think there's a strong element of that. And in some way that is like praying to God directly as well. You are establishing the order here before you hone in on what specific element of that order you're going to focus in on. I mean, with so much of an emphasis on astrology in general, the zodiacal schema that we're familiar with is based on a seasonal schema. We, at least in quote unquote Western astrology, have moved away from the sidereal notion of astrology, the zodiac being bound to the stars in this way. And it is largely seasonal, at least when it comes to the zodiac. So in going through the seasons, you're also referencing back to the zodiacal signs. And then in going to the zodiacal signs, you're also referencing the planetary intelligences as well. So even something like the four corners and the four seasons also harkens back to these other elements of, right, like the different planets and the zodiac and the different celestial layers which are related to them.
It's also a reminder that I'm sure as many of us who might listen to this podcast would agree, but sometimes it's lost in the broader culture, that in the pre-modern era, the astrologer was not just the woo-woo person saying, you shall meet the love of your life when the sun goes into Cancer or something. One function of it was predictive, but it was also to organize and ground the understanding of time, whether it was days, hours, seasons, etc., and to give an authoritative view on what time is it to the masses, which nowadays we have relegated that to technology, and many of us have lost that intimate connection with nature and the natural world, which is the source of our understanding of time, because we assume a machine can do it necessarily. But that does come up. I mean, there's a few places where he discusses the seasons. In the section, which is more astronomical, if you will, he does define the seasons. And that section was one of those beat your head against the wall sections for me, because he's actually using non-standard words for the seasons. I guess they were standard in his time. I don't know. It's called this, but then some people call it this, and etc. But he does divide them in the same way that we would divide them nowadays based on where is the moon in terms of the zodiac. Like spring is when the moon is at the beginning of Aries, and Cancer, beginning of Cancer is summer, as it is now, and so forth. So he does provide the definition and also the lunar mansions that would be rising in each season, which is useful and a practical thing and points to practicality. But yeah, there are these seasonal evocations. They're all-purpose evocations, if you will, that they've got a slot in there that you can put whatever you're trying to do with them. And they are quite complex. There's some tables in the book which mention angels ruling over each of the four seasons and the names of the four winds in the four seasons, and names for the sun and the names for the moon. So these are specific seasonal names, not standard names, not normal words. Frankly, most of them do not seem to be Arabic in origin. Some of them are. I went down far too many rabbit holes trying to figure out some of these words and names and what some of their origins might be. Some of them are clearly Arabic, like Yaqut. Okay, ruby, that's, I guess, something you could associate easily. One of the ones that I really spent too much time on is Sili, a derivative or cognate of Selene. I think I did leave in the footnote about that, but it does seem like there's stuff coming from all sorts of places, and I would, assume words and names that came into the Arabic language from before the time of Islam, and perhaps in various regions where the language or similar languages were spoken as well. So basically, it's kind of interesting from a linguistic perspective, or you can just use the names as they are and not overthink it too much. One challenge in this area, too, just being honest, is that this is one of the areas of variance, presumably because the copyists didn't have any idea what was going on, too. So if I recall, I used the set of names that was in the primary source being used, and then I put another set in the footnotes that seemed reasonable. So obviously the reader is welcome to choose whichever they want or just throw them all in. The evocations are long enough. But so yeah, you have that. You have angels associated with the cardinal directions. You have, in most of the seasonal evocations, mentions of the Jinn Kings or other Jinn, which is not really clear who they are. All sorts of things. Yeah, like the name Badroch, which is also mentioned as Badruh. I would guess that's Persian in origin. Bad is wind. Ruh, well, that's Arabic, of course, for soul, but that's also like connected to wind and so forth.
Not to harp on context again, also we're talking about people going through these processes of ritual purification and going out to distant places that are perhaps less populated by human beings and thinking about appealing to the spirits of the seasons, right? Us moderns in our fancy apartments where we get seasonal fruit from all over the world at all times of the year and we don't really think about these things as much, but someone looking at the text closer to that time period, like, oh, well, it is this season, so I should probably think about the spirit of this season and what that is. Once again, a lot of that is just context and the time period people are looking at it from. But also I'm thinking about, as you're speaking, Amina, to get back into the magical efficacy of it and why things work. The seasonal part is interesting because a lot of the research on the Hellenistic correspondences and why certain planets are exalted in certain signs and why certain planets have rulership over certain signs. One of, I think, the most convincing arguments is based on the amount of light, which is absolutely connected to the season at hand. At least we're talking about the Northern Hemisphere here. Sorry to all you Southern Hemisphere people, you can just reverse it. Don't ask me that question. But the amount of light, I think, goes pretty deep into why there are certain planetary significations and whatnot. So if you're talking about magic where, this planet is in this sign and this being part of, once again, the magical efficacy, why this works, the kind of magic that we're using here, then something like the season, let's say the beginning of fall where we hit Libra. So Saturn is traditionally exalted in Libra, and per this kind of thinking, Saturn is exalted in Libra because it's where the sun begins to reduce in light per fall, right? I guess the summer solstice we just passed is really when the light begins fading, and that's also its own thing. But per why certain planets are exalted in certain signs and its connection to the season, I think talking about the seasonal spirits and what that means does get into all of these other parts of what we're talking about, right? Like why it might be more magically efficacious to do this thing at this time. Well, one way you could look at it is the quality of light that is happening at that season. Or even, as we know, with Christmas, the winter solstice, Sol Invictus, the sun coming back from its death in this way and doing something at that time without even thinking about, Capricorn and a planet in Capricorn, but just the season that is the beginning of winter, right? The winter solstice.
That's amazing. And I'm remembering, I believe it was Dr. Stephen Skinner, but talking about there's Greco-Egyptian magical papyri from 2,000 years ago that say, unless you name the actual day, whatever day and hour that you pick the ritual, unless you literally call the spirits of the season, of the day, of the hour, of the year, you would be seen as being uninitiated, seen as somebody who is just showing up, just like you were saying, Jay, and someone who, well, you're not serious. You're just reading from a book. But if you know the specific day, hour, month, ruler of the hour, the angel of the season, the angel of autumn, all of a sudden, there's this, this person knows.
He did his homework.
Probably an interesting carryover from the PGM tradition to this, insofar as we are essentially talking about the same region. I think sometimes we conceptualize them quite differently, just because we see the Islamic world as somehow distinct from the Western world. But we are talking about the Mediterranean here. Albuni going from Algeria to Egypt. The historical link there.
You share in your presentation of the Shams al-Ma'arif that most of the evocations for each seasonal quarter of the year, quote, conclude with the formula, now, quickly, this moment. In Arabic, al-waha, al-waha, al-ajal, al-ajal, as-sa'a, as-sa'a. And you mentioned that those words, now, quickly, this moment, they frequently end Arabic adjurations. Can you share why this is from a practical perspective, or if there's any other context for the listeners out there?
Have you ever spent any time around an Arabic family trying to move their children around? something like yalla is something like that. Sorry, go ahead, Amina. That's all I have to say.
That's an excellent point. One I wouldn't have thought of, but yeah, it does give the authoritative word of finalization on what's the word? Chaotic and restless spirits. Yeah, it is quite common. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think there's something to be said just for the power of something being repeated many, many times by a lot of people, as eventually developing some sort of significance. And it's also symbolic. I'm given to understand some people finish off their stuff with so moted be. That's their ending. And this is their ending as well. It has been suggested, and I think there's some merit to this, that perhaps you might need to encourage the spirits to get the job done in a timely manner. If you need your rent money, you don't need it 3 years later. It's very nice if it comes 3 years later, but you need it right now. And they might have a little bit of a different conception of time or necessity. And that being said, to my understanding, a similar formula also appears in the PGM. I don't think it's necessarily a finishing text, but you do adjure the students. Wow, that was some sort of weird Freudian slip. You adjure the spirits to do things now, to do it quickly, to do it immediately. And I think it probably is a regional or shared cultural thing that dates back to some time in history. I don't know if it's ancient history or just a few hundred years back or whatever, but it dates back, and it probably just got integrated into this because it is also, I think, a very normal sort of thing that people want to do. They like to have a finishing ritual. Even if you're talking about school, maybe you ring the bell at the end of class and that's your authoritative, it has been done. I'm just going to throw this out there since we did bring up the Shi'i tradition briefly. There is one Shi'i prayer that does end with a similar formula, which, it does suggest there is sometimes some back and forth between what goes on in the occult world and what goes on in what's considered the more orthodox world. Orthodox for Shi'is, obviously, I'm aware some people do not consider it orthodox. It does basically have the same thing, it's the ending and we're seeking this now and very urgently. So it is common, and some people do consider it to be very effective, this happened to so-and-so because they were calling on jinn and then they said this. Okay, God knows best. But that's an interesting observation, and it is an interesting thing to discuss.
We have a listener question for you, both from Octavian Graves. And Octavian is asking, do you feel that the jinn and the goetic spirits, and I believe Octavian is referring to the 72 spirits in the Lemegeton's Goetia, the very well-known European grimoire, are they the same thing or a completely separate species of spirit? And just to put a little context with Octavian's question, there are spirits in the Lemegeton's Goetia, like a Maimon, for example, that might be very similar to having, Arabic language cognates and things like that, or Astaroth, going way back to the goddess Astarte. So can you share about anything regarding the spiritual relationships between, say, the Islamic esoteric context and, say, like the European grimoiric context?
I hate to keep harping on context again and again, but of course it comes up with this as well. And what Muslim people, I guess, coming from these kinds of cultural backgrounds would call the jinn oftentimes varies just so much as it is. It becomes more often than not an all-inclusive category for everything, of course, that are not human, that are not angels, that is not God. That's the main distinction right there. But everything from UFOs, aliens, the dead, the distinction between what we would call the dead or ghosts and jinn is one that I'm fascinated with, and I don't want to rant on or harp on too much, but it's extremely ambiguous what that category even is for many, many people. But by and large, it is all spirits that are not angels, that are not humans, and that is not God. So I would say you could include, from a Muslim context, you would include all of the spirits in the Goetia as jinn. But from the context of someone just looking at the Goetia, you wouldn't do that back. right? You wouldn't go vice versa with that per se. I'm sure you'd say, oh, well, this spirit comes from this culture and this, because jinn is a very particular cultural iteration or name for, frankly, many, many, many different kinds of spirits. Or if we're going to categorize spirits, what people coming from a non-Muslim background would have many different names for other kinds of spirits. And of course, there are different categories of jinn as well, not that there's only one kind of jinn. But I've seen so many things lumped into jinn that the clearest answer I can say is that everything in the Goetia from a Muslim context would be considered jinn, but that's all deities from other cultures, Hindu deities and Greek deities and all this stuff, as that would all be considered jinn in some sense. And I've heard many people refer to them in that exact way. But if someone's just like looking at the Goetia and knows a few different things or a lot of different things about many cultures, they would say, oh, well, I'm not going to call all of these spirits jinn, or some, as you said, maybe with more Arabic sounding names. Well, I'm going to call those ones jinn, and the other ones are maybe from a different culture, a different cultural paradigm about the quote unquote other spirits.
True, and certainly when it comes to the 72 beings, which we are referring to as the Goetia or beings or Goetic spirits, I'm sure many of us know people who get into many impassioned arguments about what they are, and they don't agree. So some people say they are spirits akin to jinn or thought forms, or it's all in your mind, or it's deities or whatever. So we're not having any agreement there either. But yeah, I would agree there's a couple ways to see it. I mean, one thing with respect to context is that the Goetia tends to be seen in the light of a dichotomy between angels and demons, or good versus evil, or the unredeemed and so forth, or potentially redeemable for people who like to try to do that sort of thing. Whereas in the Islamic context, jinn is a little bit more neutral. Jinn are not inherently evil, although some are, but jinn can occupy a space of neutrality and be neither good nor evil. So from a broader perspective, I would agree with Jay's answer that the word jinn in the Quranic usage, which has come into normal use, it just means an unseen being. So that would encompass any being that has some sort of intelligence or agency or will that's not made of the same stuff that you and I are. Which some people might even include angels, even though angels are considered to be made of different stuff than jinn. But the point is, it is a blanket term. That said, there is stuff that is generally agreed to be jinn and stuff that's not, in kind of a sense that maybe there are invisible beings that they don't fit kind of what people expect from jinn. So from a more restricted viewpoint, I would be of the view that the 72 spirits in the Goetia also are not all the same as each other. They've got their own characteristics and behaviors and means of interaction. And I would personally apply the word jinn to some of them, not necessarily all of them, just because we're not talking about all the same thing, even if some people might just be contextualizing it as these are the demons. But of course, there's a diversity there. So I would say that there is an argument to say that, yes, technically they are all jinn, but maybe in terms of practical similarities, some yes and some no. It's very difficult to get concrete answers on these sorts of things. If you want to argue historically, I mean, again, people will be very impassioned about their arguments, who is Astaroth, for example. But how do you know after all this time, how do you know what someone had in mind when they were writing something down or drawing a sigil or whatever? And also, the only other way people might have a viewpoint is based on personal experience. And will that be accepted by someone else? So that's my viewpoint on the matter.
So much of that is our own linguistic stuff, right? Like the spirits are like, oh, sure, yeah, I'm a jinn. Or, they have their own names for themselves, which by and large is probably not jinn. They have their own tribes, they have their own groups, they have their own names. This is how they're thought to be in the first place. As well as all this, as I mentioned, mixture with like what we're going to consider dead people. And as a dead person, the same as, in other cultures, they talk about the same thing with fairy and everything else, like the closeness between the world of the dead and the world of the fairy, and how some humans may cross more into the other and then vice versa in this way. And you really get the same thing with the jinn. So not only is there all this ambiguity and subtlety, and once again, they are subtle beings. And of course, it is going to be an ambiguous discussion no matter how you slice it. But they have their own names for themselves and they have their own groups and everything else. And I think a lot of it is just us working out what we want to agree upon for terms and everything else. And the spirits are just like, okay, sure, are you a jinn? Yes. Why not? That's what you want to, sure,
Yeah,
Let's
and
go
many
with it.
people may put forward the view that things will tend to appear as the evoker expects them to appear.
For the vast majority of Muslims, a dead person is nothing really but a ruse of a jinn. So if you're sitting in a seance and a dead person comes through, quite a few Muslims, I would say the vast majority, would probably say, well, that's just a jinn. Or the person's qareen or something coming through and speaking. It's not actually the dead person. And once again, it's complicated because that's eschatology. That's the way Islam has laid over cultures who have much older and indigenous beliefs about the afterlife and the dead and everything else and how those things have interacted and whatnot. An anthropological example I bring up is a book, I think it was originally done in French or German, but the English translation is Ghost Riders of Upper Egypt, about these Egyptian peasants who become possessed by the dead, become possessed by their ancestors for healing. And the initial response of the people in the village is, okay, well, we have to do all these tests to make sure it's not a jinn, because by and large, it's very, very unlikely it's a dead person. So there's all these things, and everyone in the society is like, it's probably a jinn, and that puts the pressure on and tests the situation. And then if the spirit keeps coming through, they're like, okay, well, what side of the body is the spirit possessing me on? If it is a dead person, then if it's coming through on the left side of the body, maybe it's a dead person or a jinn who is an unbeliever, because jinn belong to the many different religions as well. There are Muslim jinn, Christian jinn, Hindu jinn, everything else. And if it's coming through on the right side, this is a righteous, believing Muslim jinn, or at the very end of it, a dead ancestor, and people finally accept that this is the dead person. And so there's so many different layers in this way. It's so contextual, and I hate constantly coming back to that. And I don't mean to use that as a crutch, but it truly is.
We have one last listener question for you, and this one is from Amir Q. And Amir Q is asking and saying, "Hi, Dr. Inloes and Jay. I come from a Sunni family, and I remember hearing my grandfather talk about, quote, asking the exorcist when there was a need to have spirits removed from someone. However, I see more European contexts not even recognize this tradition of exorcism, or it's not as developed. Why was this case historically?" And Amir says it always seemed more natural to me to have specialists available when they were needed. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm not an expert in the history of exorcism in Europe. There are other people who could come onto the podcast and do that. But to my understanding, historically, there was a more similar practice between Muslims and Christians, including Christians in Europe, because obviously there's various practices among Christians around the world as well. Just from what I understand, there were some of the same approaches. First, the belief that someone can be possessed by a being with intelligence and agency that's causing some problems for them, and therefore someone should come and remove that being. It seems like some of the same techniques historically have been used. Scripture asserting divine power, and substances like holy water, blessed water. So for a Muslim case, you might be reciting Quran over the water. Same thing with oil, salt. And also a sense that sometimes medical problems might also be solved by an exorcism. That it's not, again, not just all the secular world that you go to the doctor and get your medication or whatever, but that the invisible world may also be causing some problems. I think maybe the difference is that belief is still there in a lot of the Muslim world. And when people have medical problems that they can't solve, they will tend to call up the local exorcist and see if that solves it. And to be blunt, sometimes it does. So I do think that historically, and this is a very big generalization because I certainly can't speak for every part of Europe, but historically it seems to have been done. I think some of the differences are, one difference is, I'm not quite sure historically when this happened or like when it intensified. But I think in the modern era, in the West or the Christian West, exorcism is seen as a battle between good and evil and slaying the demons. And maybe this is due to film also and computer games. And all of these things that do build on that sort of archetypal story of the holy warrior fighting the demon. Whereas I would say among Muslims in general, I don't want to generalize, but in general, it just tends to be treated a little bit, I guess I'd say a little bit more as a medical issue, like you've got a problem and we need to remove it. And maybe your problem is a jinn. Not that we're necessarily going to come out and slay the demons, but it doesn't belong there. It's causing a problem. And one way we may be able to deal with that is through the invocation of divine power. So I think that's one difference. Again, a generalization. I think also when you look at the era when there seems to have been a lot of fear of demons and evil and witches, so the era of the witch hunt in Europe and the New World, this does seem to have coincided with a lot of other social and political changes. I mean, the time, I'm not saying there weren't witch hunts beforehand, but sort of the peak of that period was basically the period of the formation of the West as we know it today, and also the Protestant Reformation, the building of the pre-modern empires, like the British Empire, and also the colonization of the New World. And so I get a sense at least that the shift to that sort of just attack and kill the evil, it was sort of a reflex against the other. And sometimes the other, might have been a Catholic in some contexts, and sometimes frequently the other was a woman that's sort of feared. In the case of the Inquisition, it might have been a Muslim or a Jew. In the Americas, the native population. But it does seem that this shift in, what it meant to fight the demonic, if you will, was very much tied into what was going on a sort of mass socio-political level. And it also calmed down after that shift basically transformed into what we have today and solidified into the concept of Europe or the concept of the West, which of course also took place alongside what some people call the so-called Enlightenment. I will leave it to the listeners to decide whether it was or was not enlightened. But again, that was a shift which did ultimately lead to a secular viewpoint, which again did remove the acceptability of things such as possession and exorcism in much of public discourse. I'm not going to say all of public discourse because obviously it's still done. I think Trump's wife had an exorcist clean out the White House, but before they moved in. And I think it did actually become more popular among the, I don't know what to call it, Christian or nominally Christian population, for example, in the US in the latter part of the 20th century. So there's stuff that's happened there, but it's not that it wasn't done in the past, whereas among Muslims, it does tend to be done. Of course, Muslims have a variety of viewpoints too on whether it should be done or whether it's effective. But I would say that in my experience, even some of the most atheist and secular people from Muslim majority countries, when things start to go wrong, someone's cursing me. It's jinn. People. That's
everyone. Everyone thinks that.
They drop their disbelief very quickly, and it is quite common. In fact, it's a very thriving business in London presently. I say business because people do sell services doing this sort of thing. It's not something that's necessarily talked about a lot, I think, with respect to the Muslim community. And of course, the other side of that, in the UK in particular, is the media has picked up on it as some sort of sensationalism, basically for people from Muslim majority countries, also sub-Saharan Africa. Like, look at these people, they have these exorcists, they think people are possessed. And then they usually pick out the horror stories of where the exorcist has crossed their professional boundaries and done things they shouldn't have been doing, which is very sad. Of course, abuses happen in any service with a client or a healer, a one-to-one service. And so that's also created a secondary issue here, both in terms of the media and legality. Like there was a case a while back where an exorcist was, I think, it was in trouble with the government because they treated a child or I think it was a teenager that the parents brought. So their thought was basically like the teenager is not at an age of consent for this sort of thing. So I think I veered way off topic, but maybe I haven't because we have an example of clashing customs and ideas about this sort of thing. But definitely, it is a complicated subject when you get into some of the ways it might work in secular law, because it's not the sort of thing you can regulate neatly in a secular system. I mean, you might say certain behaviors are against the law, like, God forbid, if someone is physically or sexually or something abusing the person they're claiming to treat, yeah, you can say, okay, that's wrong and put them in prison. But you obviously can't necessarily regulate in the secular system, is this person possessed? And was this treatment effective? And was this the right thing to do? And that sort of thing. So it is in any case quite common in this day and age among Muslims, but maybe less discussed, but still done among other peoples in the West.
My favorite example, because it, I think, covers the whole spectrum or much of the spectrum, as well as it being a passion of mine, is Zar, which is a practice of trance possession, spirit possession, primarily through music, practiced throughout East Africa, North Africa, parts of the Middle East. And in reading the anthropological literature, there's oftentimes this really great movement through the different stages of someone coming to realize that they are possessed and what they go to do about it, which I think is illustrative for the question. Because, of course, exorcist tradition exists in the Muslim world. It just manifests in these different ways, and Amina was speaking to much of that. But in Zar, by and large, so someone lives mostly in an area where this is something that exists. I'm sure it happens in places where it doesn't exist, and they have to go further from home to find the healing that they need. But someone feels like there's a physical and spiritual or mental ailment. And first they'll go to the quote unquote Western doctor, right? That's usually the first thing that they'll do to get the physical examination. Like, oh, let me check your pulse. Let me do all these regular things that we would go and get a physical. And then if the symptoms continue to persist after that, they're taking medication or something, it's not making a difference, then they'll usually go to the equivalent of a Muslim holy person, al-Hakim or Fakir, someone who's considered a wise person involved with the religion, who knows these different kinds of cures through things that we've been discussing, actually. Maybe they even have a copy of the Shams al-Ma'arif stashed away somewhere secretly. But they're absolutely adept in the use of the names of God, right? Verses of the Quran, Arabic letters. So this person will say, as a form of exorcism, you have this spirit, and in some contexts, they will actually do a divination, for example, to see the kind of spirit that the person has. Maybe they'll do a little bibliomancy with the Quran, and then they'll prescribe them some kind of to recite certain verses, right? Or to drink this consecrated ink with verses of the Quran, or they'll write something on a piece of paper, a small talisman, once again, letters, names of God, and place it upon a particular part of the person's body, as well as reciting things in front of them actively to the spirit to attempt to remove them. What I like about Zod is because sometimes this doesn't work either. Sometimes this isn't enough. It doesn't necessarily end there. So with this particular class of spirits, thought of as red jinn, in the milieu of Al-Ahmar, right? Zar is having to do with this particular class of spirits who can only be exorcised through initiating into the cult itself. So after these people have gone through these various stages, including going to a traditional Muslim healer who uses, once again, the Quran and these kinds of things to exorcise the person, then they go to, by and large, would be a woman in a Zar cult or group, and tell them what's going on. And then that woman will do a divination, and that might vary in the way that they're going to do the divination, but they will come to tell the person that they have this particular Zar, and that the Zar is asking for this and this particular thing. And usually that involves initiation into the cult. And then once one has initiated into the cult through the use of music and dance and trance possession, that is thought of as the form of exorcism for their particular spirit that they have. That is the way that they remove the illness brought on by the possession of this particular spirit. That is actually the way that they do it, through first the initiation into the cult, and that is the propitiation of the spirit, with song, with food, with incense, all these kinds of things, celebration, and then the actual dance and music, which is the act of exorcism. And I love Zar for this very reason, because exorcism is not a one-dimensional thing culturally, and this exists in a largely Muslim paradigm, right? There's a Muslim overlay over this, and that sometimes figures more or less into the kinds of spirits that are at play here. But I do think it's very informative to see these different stages that people go through and to see that there is more even for some beyond the level of just going to a traditional healer or even a quote unquote Western, physical doctor in that way.
Yeah, although going back to the point about why people are afraid of Shams al-Ma'arif, to be fair, some people accept the invitation and some don't. Some person might have a spirit problem and then choose to initiate into something related to it. And some people will fight tooth and nail to get rid of it and never have anything to do with it again in their lives. So people vary.
When we think of the Shams al-Ma'arif, and as you were going through this process, can you share with the listeners, what are 2 or 3 of the biggest misconceptions about the Shams al-Ma'arif that maybe you hear in a common way, or what are 2 or 3 of the big things or that people might not understand correctly about the Shams that you would love for people to just keep in mind as they go through the text?
Well, one thing people should keep in mind is they shouldn't expect it to be easy. There are some parts of the text that are easier than others, and I've certainly done my best to try to make it readable and accessible, but it is a complex book in a complex tradition, a little bit more along the lines of some of the Solomonic literature. I think that's a good comparison. I'm just putting that in the context of some of what one can buy today. For example, books by someone who I certainly would have never read called Damon Brand are rumored to give very quick solutions and very easy solutions to the problems one might face in life. This does have some things that are simple, and I do think the recitations of the names of Allah are probably the easiest things in the book to do on a practical level. But it is complex, and the book is also organized in a little bit of a spirally fashion. It does say stuff, and then it goes back to it later, and maybe goes back to it later. It's not lacking organization. But in this day and age, many people, myself included, sometimes don't have the patience to sit through a lot of text because we're just inundated with so much text nowadays. I want to find what I'm looking for and find it right away so I don't have to read the whole book, etc. I'm not talking about Shams al-Ma'arif, but just in general. So keep in mind it's something for the long haul, even though one can also just open it up to different parts and look at different things and check them out and so forth. Jay, do you want to add one too?
I think we've covered a lot of the different misconceptions, even just through speaking with one another over the course of the podcast. I'll just reaffirm something that I said, which is that I think it's incorrect to look at the Shams al-Ma'arif as just quote unquote a book of magic or a grimoire or a book filled with spells. I do think there's a very deep cosmological component there. There's a orderly universe, and that, I believe, is the primary reason that the magic is going to be effective for people. Of course, you can open it up, flip to a page, and just do this thing to get this result, of course, in that same way that not everybody's going to interact with this stuff in the same way. But I think it is a misconception to look at it as just that, because it's so much richer than that, too. I think that does a disservice to, once again, the spirits around the book, to Al-Buni himself, and to this tradition, frankly. There's a lot more beauty and elegance there than just open it up because you're desiring of a thing and the formula. So that's one. And once again, I know I've been saying that a lot, but as an important misconception for sure. And then another thing that I've also been speaking to that I think it's worth mentioning again in the misconceptions section, and I would put this forward as something just important to remember when it comes to the Shams al-Ma'arif, but also things similar to the Shams al-Ma'arif, is that we can't remove these things from what we'd call our politics or our social situations. And that goes beyond just our religion or us as Muslims or non-Muslims or whatever religion or spiritual system we subscribe to, or whatever God we believe in that way, or not believing in a God, that we can't extricate these as much as we might want to, these esoteric texts, these things which are, once again, very metaphysically elegant and beautiful and high and elevated in all these ways, absolutely. But they still cannot be removed from their political, historical context, especially when it comes to things that are as maligned, and as feared as we've been discussing as this book and similar books. And it's always important for people to remember that. And it's kind of become a bit of a rant of mine because I've seen different YouTube comments and little things responding of like, oh, why are you talking so much about all of these people liking it to some kind of like leftist agenda, harping on context so much, right? But it's like, no, this is part of the magic itself, I believe, and we can't remove it from this. We have to be, in a sense, politically engaged to also be magically engaged with the book. That's a very personal response on my end, but I think anything, especially coming from the Muslim world, and especially in the post 9/11 era in the West, and the way Western people have viewed Muslims in many respects as so much of an other, which of course that's not a new thing. I'm not saying that's a new thing, but just with the political climate being what it is, still continuously Islamophobia being what it is, that you cannot remove this book from any of that. And it should not be removed from that. And that should always be kept at the forefront of the mind in working with this sort of thing, whether you're a Muslim or not, frankly.
Thanks to both of your efforts, and as you've mentioned, other scholars, Dr. Liana Saif, Dr. Ali Alomi, Dr. Sayed Ahmed, and many more, do you think that we're going to see more translations, more cross-pollinations, more understanding, as both of you have been intimating, between other traditions? Do you think that this is a trend that's continuing to go that way?
I think that one parallel that can be made between the Islamic Golden Age, which flourished a bit before Al-Buni, and today, is that if anyone's at all familiar with Islamic hate occult literature, they're probably familiar with the Arabic translation movement from about the 7th to 10th centuries to translate a lot of ancient Greek material, including astrological texts and so forth, into Arabic, and sometimes to write things and, pretend that an ancient Greek person wrote it because it was cool, or that person was important, or they didn't want to admit writing it, or whatever. So you have the pseudo texts, and you have the apparently real texts and the confusions and so forth. But there was a translation movement then. But currently today, we are also having an English language translation movement due to the spread of English as a global language. And obviously not just in this subject area, but there's so much world literature, past and present, that has been rendered in English that was not available 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And of course, translation is an active process in many languages. I don't know how it compares statistically, but there is in any case an English language translation movement in general, including with respect to the occult texts. So from that angle, I'm sure there will be more forthcoming, and I'm sure we're all aware of various projects in the works in this area. And of course, the other difference today is it is the internet era, so it's very easy to share ideas and for people to look into things that they might not have encountered in their neighborhood, say 60 years ago, but you can correspond with someone in another country quite easily and get new ideas. I would say the cross-pollination does work both ways. There are plenty of people in the Muslim majority world who have taken an interest in various things that might have been more confined to Western countries in the past. For example, I think I can mention him and he won't mind. I have a pen pal in Pakistan, a young man, and he's very dedicatedly working through the, Initiation into Hermetics by Franz Bardon. So that's his thing. And it's not maybe the first thing someone's going to encounter there, but because we're all connected, there's more of a tendency to try new things and try different things. So overall, I think there's a lot of cross-pollination, especially for people who have an interest in the subject area, the same people who might have an interest in the Taoist heritage, for example, or to just learn different things to assist. Like some people might study traditional Chinese medicine or Qigong and so forth because they see how it's all dealing with the same ultimate reality and the same capacities of the human being to interact with it, even though the cultural frameworks or flavors might be a bit different. That said, are we moving towards an era of greater mutual understanding as human beings? I am less optimistic about that. We have greater communications technology and access to information in potential. In reality, maybe it's the large numbers we have, billions of people as human beings. I think we have a maximum number of people we can sort of process, and then we end up being very tribal and shutting out the things that are different. So I'm not quite sure we're there yet in terms of an era of global understanding, but I do think this is one field where, as there was historically, there is and will continue to be cross-pollination.
A lot of people have been in astrology circles speculating on the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces is like, well, is this the ultimate point of saturation for the popularity of astrology? As Amina mentioned earlier, astrology has become extremely popular. I mean, this is Arabic magic, this kind of thing. It's also become a pretty hot and trendy thing in many respects as well. So I think people are also having the conversation of, have we reached a point of saturation as well, where we might be seeing more of a potential backlash too in certain ways, that now when something becomes so saturated, you start getting the people who are like, wait, maybe let's take a step back, and maybe this shouldn't be as available as it is, or maybe we shouldn't be as open to all of this stuff as we have been. I'm speaking mostly to the context of people speaking about this stuff in like the United States, for example, versus the whole Muslim world or something like that. So I think the discussion around astrology could also be applied to this, to go back to Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions now happening in air signs. I think you could also apply that to this, right? Where you're going to get more and more scanned PDFs of manuscripts available, and people at home attempting to make these translations themselves, and some of them perhaps being very good translations, and people doing the work. And there's going to be a huge availability, I think, especially of online material, which obviously is also not new, but we're only going to see an increase in that. But we also might be seeing perhaps the darker sides of that, as opposed to like, oh, well, we have so much, the other side of that being a less grounded version of it, which I see because a lot of what I'm working in is aesthetics and art. And for example, a lot of people use a lot of images of jinn from these different manuscripts that they don't actually know what the text says or anything, but they'll go on Pinterest and pull these different images from jinn manuscripts and cut and paste them in various sources and in films and in art and everything else. So I think this is an example, once again, of like how all of that stuff seeps out there in a very far along way, but it doesn't necessarily have a depth of understanding or a grounding to it. Like that movement from earth signs into air signs, like the air stuff, it spreads very far in the way that air does, but it isn't necessarily deep or substantive, right?
And sometimes the stuff has a mind of its own and wants to seep.
Absolutely. Definitely.
So you both came together for this amazing project, and, this begs the question, are there any plans for future collaborations, other chapters, other engagements?
With respect to this particular book, I think that it definitely should all be rendered into English, and I'm sure it will happen. As for my own relationship to that happening, I don't like to talk about things until they're done, especially with respect to this book, just because so many people have been saying, I'm going to do it, and, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So I don't want to be that person. There was some progress made on what would be considered volume 2 before I came down with what was probably a pretty rough case of COVID and then post-COVID. And I've also had 2 other books to finish, and I just had to stop it because you can't work on too many at once. One was the Hand of Fatima book that I mentioned, and then a tafsir or exegesis of the Quran volume, which I'm way overdue on. So, we never know what's going to happen in life and what's going to interfere or how our circumstances might change. But definitely, I would enjoy continuing on the project, while at the same time, I do think this sort of thing is best done by a group of people because everyone has something different to contribute. And a book like this, it's just got so much that every area of expertise is going to bring something new to the picture. You know, some people might have a literary sense or a really good linguistic sense. They're good at chasing up those obscure words, which weren't as numerous as they could have been. But, you know, some people might be good at the etymology. Some people might be good at how these things are done in practice. Some people are good with the astrological theory. Some people are good with the sort of creeping in of Neoplatonic theory and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people can put their own angle on. With respect to myself, I won't commit, while at the same time I will say there is some stuff living on my hard drive. Please don't delete yourself now. You know, Jin, don't come and delete it.
To what Amina just said, I feel like my angle was very much around the lunar mansions in particular, and the depiction, the illustration of said lunar mansions. And that is work I plan on continuing in my own practice. But when it comes to the Shams al-Ma'arif in particular, I think I'm respectfully saying I've said my piece and I've contributed the things I think I can contribute. And that will most likely be it for me on that end. Although, of course, as I said, things parallel to the text and related to the text I will be continuing with in my own work.
Of course, listeners, make sure to check out the video and the podcast descriptions for a link to Revelore Press to pick up your copy of the Shams al-Ma'arif. But where else can people find you if they're interested in your scholarly works, your research, your artistic endeavors?
I have never made a hub for my work, which leads some people to think that I don't do anything, because what could she possibly be doing if she doesn't have her own personal web page advertising herself, and she doesn't post advertisements of what she's doing on Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever. So that's that. I just have the philosophy that I do stuff and I put it out there and it goes wherever it's meant to go and it takes on its own life. I don't have a problem with people having a hub, and I like to see various people's, Twitter feeds or whatever and see what they're doing. This has just been my way of interacting with the world. That said, for this particular subject area, there is a dedicated Twitter page and Instagram page to the book and related material. The Twitter feed is called Son of Knowledge Shams al-Ma'arif, and the username is @Arabic __ magic. So you got 2 underscores there. If you just put one, you're getting to the wrong person. And the page admin, which might be me, occasionally posts things that might be of interest. And it's interesting to me also to see what people like. And I haven't really, for the most part, had any sort of plan or schedule. It's just like, I saw this manuscript yesterday. This picture looked nice. Speaking of pictures, speaking of like people grabbing stuff on Pinterest and stuff, I posted a Talisman of Iblis the other day just because I came across it, and it was, it was interesting. As one does. I put one of Malik Madhab too, just to balance it out a little bit. And also that one had a little bit more interesting, like talisman-y stuff on it, even though the resolution wasn't as good. And of course, beautiful, like drawing of, gold illuminated manuscript and stuff. But that seems to have been well liked by a number of people. And then sometimes I post stuff and it doesn't really get a lot of attention. So I try to keep it just to things that I think that people might be interested in if they have an interest in the subject area, and not to spend time getting into other subjects which are off topic, because I know that just kind of takes up people's time. So there is a central location for that on Twitter and also on Instagram. What's the handle for the Instagram again?
It's the same. Yeah. @Arabic __ magic. And please don't send messages about how to curse people and do all this stuff anymore. You're not going to get responded to. Unless you want those, Amina, on the Twitter.
No, it's totally fine. You can handle the.
No, I don't. I don't want them. I just want people to look at pretty pictures. That's what the Instagram is for. That's it. Just pretty pictures. I can be found at, I guess it's kind of a hub, Star Night Dwell, StarNightDwell, Star Night Dwell, on Twitter, on Instagram, and also starnightdwell.com, which is the main hub. It's a fairly new, I'm calling it a platform. It feels like a platform. I also have a podcast and a show associated with Star Night Dwell called A Star Night Dwell. Amina was the second guest discussing her book on the Khamsa that she mentioned earlier in this show. So if you're interested more in that or in the show, and the nature of the show and of my platform is constellating astrology with art and the imagination. And so I plan on probably opening up my books for divination in the near future, as well as getting up some class recordings and other things. But you can also find links to the show and whatnot on my website. And always with me, art stuff, and a little less now. I'm about to start graduate school. I'm very busy with art things already, but that's mostly where you can find me.
Anything else that you would like to leave the listeners with?
Well, I would say this is just speaking on my personal experience, and I don't want to project on anyone, but it is personally meaningful to me to be able to have this conversation at all and to be able to involve a diversity of listeners and people from various areas, just because living in the era of Islamophobia, pre 9/11 was one kind of Islamophobia, which a lot of times was just ignorance, or, sometimes people would just pass, if I said this, they'd be, oh yeah, those Eastern people are superstitious and, kind of exotic and genie in the lamp. So maybe not taking things seriously. And then post 9/11, a much heavier form of Islamophobia, sometimes violent Islamophobia. I mean, I have been attacked by people yelling Islamophobic slogans. So given that context, and I know it's not everyone, but when you do experience it becomes part of your worldview. It's meaningful to be able to speak about an important book in the Arab and the Islamic heritage, and to be able to share it. It feels good to see that other people also appreciate it, and that we can find some common ground despite all of the ugliness that has gone on in the past decades, largely, I think, due to political circumstances outside of all of our control. To me, that's very refreshing, even if some people think the book is very evil. I think it's also done something very good.
I'll second that. That's a really good way to end things. I'll definitely second that. Thanks for having us on. And I think it's an absolute blessing we have this forum and other forums to be able to talk about these things with many like-minded people. And thank you for the listener questions, which were really high quality, and that everyone was nice and friendly too. That's also important, that everyone is just really cool about this stuff, or has been, at least on this show. So thank you for having us. And yes, Amina, I feel really blessed to even be able to do this in the first place.
The honor and the pleasure is certainly mine, and I know that the listeners agree. The Shamsa Ma'arif, the Son of Knowledge from Revelore Press, Dr. Amina Inloes and J. Hamade, thank you both just so much just for taking the time and sharing about this wonderful, wonderful presentation of this amazing work with the listeners today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Listeners and patrons, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Talk about illuminating the cross-pollination and sharing about such a rich and vast Islamic esoteric tradition. It was so wonderful to learn from Dr. Amina Inloes and J. Hamade. Definitely make sure to check out the links below to get your own copy of the Shams al-Ma'arif, and also for ways to follow both Dr. Inloes and Jay on social media and check out all of their amazing work. Also, such excellent questions as usual from you, the incredible and erudite Glitch Bottle patrons on Patreon. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Without your support, the podcast would not exist and continue to grow in new and interesting ways. And if you'd like to support the Glitch Bottle podcast with some exclusive perks for you, please head over to patreon.com/glitchbottle, and I will see you there. As always, this is Alexander Eth cheering you on to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.